Hello! Continuing from the previous video about why, although kin selection is a valid idea and there's evidence for it, evolutionary psychologists are not correct to say that their citation of kin selection occurring actually succeeds in refuting Ayn Rand's theory of objectivist ethics. Particularly her theory of rational, peaceable egoism. You might, wonder why at the beginning of these videos I just sit here smiling and I don't speak immediately. It's because when I start recording, so for some reason Google Hangouts goes on mute when I start recording, and so if I start speaking as soon as it starts recording, that part's muted. But recently I noticed even if I wait, the beginning is muted anyway. If I were a technical person, I might know what's going on there. I apologize about this. And so this is part 2. In part 1, I explained what kin selection is and how it did occur in the Stone Age, and why when people are being dismissive and say, well, evolutionary psychology is just genetic determinism, that's not an adequate rebuttal because that's a straw man. Evolutionary psychology is not genetic determinism, and it recognizes that that the customs it discusses are not necessarily genetically determined, that they are a result of cultural conditioning. Evolutionary psychologists should also acknowledge that these were invented by individuals, but they seldom do acknowledge that. They think this is a nature versus nurture, and they don't recognize that what's more important than shaping you as an adult, shaping what you are today as an adult, it's more important in contributing to making you you than nature or nurture is your choices, your free will, your volition. But that's part of what I'm going to address in this segment. But evolutionary psychology is not genetic determinism, and therefore when evolutionary psychologists say things that are improper or incorrect or not supported by evidence, it's not an adequate rebuttal to them to say, well, you're just genetic determinists, because they're not. And evolutionary psychology does deserve to be taken seriously, even when it's incorrect, because the general thrust of it, the general idea that there are customs and institutions that are the result of natural selection and kin selection in the Stone Age, there's merit to that. And so let's talk about this. There's something I forgot to mention last time. There's an experiment cited by Alison Gopnik, a child psychologist, in favor of what she thinks is in favor of the idea that you might be born with this emotional predisposition toward having collectivist us versus them mentality. And this is how the experiment goes. There is a box full of shirts, and their child sizes for about preschool. These shirts are for preschoolers or kindergartners, and each shirt is either all green or all orange. Those are the only two. Those are the only colors they come in. And one at a time, a child who's a preschool age or kindergarten age will enter the room. And at random, the psychologist or whoever's conducting the experiment will randomly pull out one of the shirts out of the box. He or she hasn't decided ahead of time whether it's green or orange. But this psychologist takes the shirt out of the box and immediately plops it on top of the child. So the child is now wearing either a green shirt or an orange shirt. Then the psychologist shows the child a series of photographs of other children, and each photograph, each photograph has one child in it. And the child either has a green shirt or an orange shirt. And the psychologist asks, would you be willing to play with this child in this photo? Yes or no? And the psychologist goes over the photos one by one. And even when you match for things like race or ethnicity, if that's matched, basically psychologists find that more that is more that in comparison with the controls, the child will, by a significant margin, much more so than the control, the child will want to play with children who are wearing the same color t-shirt that he or she is, even though the child, him or herself, wasn't given any choice on what color he or she wore. So the conclusion the psychologists draw from this is that even though the color of the shirt was picked at random, green or orange, once the child is wearing the shirt, the us versus them mentality kicks in, and the child will side with children who were wearing the same color shirt. So if we take that conclusion as accurate, I don't think it's a concession to genetic determinism or any type of biological determinism, because what these psychologists are experimenting for is what is the default visceral response. What would you do on impulse? But as I will get into for this segment, you have a sapient mind, you have conscious, rational decision-making mind, and just because you might have one immediate emotional response, it doesn't follow that you have to act on it all the time. You can overrule a visceral response. Well, you can overrule the immediate knee-jerk sort of emotional response. So maybe if I see people who are like me, like the same ethnicity as me, maybe my immediate reaction is, oh, I'm going to side with them because they have this superficial similarity with me. But then my conscious mind kicks in and I think, is that really a good enough reason to side with someone? Are you going to agree with people just because they share the superficial trait with you that neither of you chose? And that when you have that rational decision-making process, that's necessarily individualistic in many important respects. And I think it's that psychological individualism that is in support of the objectivist ethics. So for this, I'm going to have to explain alternative reproductive strategies. And what I mean by this is that in this context, a reproductive strategy means that when members of a species procreate, normally they go through a specific set of behaviors, a sequence of behaviors, a specific procedure that will help them reproduce, that will help them mate and spawn offspring. You see, there's often more than one way this can be done, and I'll get to what that means. But when the organism goes through a specific sequence of events, takes a specific route in procreating, that is a reproductive strategy. And they don't always do it the same way. Sometimes one way is the norm, but sometimes there are other members that take a different route. They go about it a different way, that possibly might provide them a different advantage than with the mainline. So there's a mainline reproductive strategy, and sometimes there are alternative reproductive strategies. And sometimes when the environmental circumstances change, what was once the alternative reproductive strategy taken by a minority might become the mainline reproductive strategy of the majority. And I guess you could say that the term strategy here is misleading. I admit that to use the term strategy is misleading because a strategy is a very consciously determined plan. When you have a strategy, it's a plan you consciously thought out. A strategy is a conscious plan by a sapient organism. And when different organisms undergo reproductive strategies, when we're not talking about human beings, This is not some sort of conscious plan that came through a sapient rational faculty. It's just that this organism happens in its own way to go through a specific procedure that will possibly help that organism procreate. So if we talk about reproductive strategies in the case of hominids, our hominid ancestors. Now, Sarah Blackford Hardy, the evolutionary psychologist, talks about the emergence of monogamy and pair bonds. And so basically, this is how people often caricature evolutionary psychologists. They think this is how evolutionary psychologists think. They say, well, evolutionary psychologists think that men and women are in conflict because the man is incentivized to have as many sex partners as possible so that he can spread his seed in as many women as possible, which will maximize his chances of spreading his genes to the next generation. But for women, it's different because, because if you're a woman, and if you have sex and get pregnant, that's much costlier. That's much more of an investment, because you're going to be pregnant and vulnerable for 9 months. At least a week, you're going to be dependent on people to take care of you. So you want to be more careful about who you have sex with. So therefore, men are very indiscriminate about sex. They'll have sex with any woman, and women have to be choosy. Okay, so a lot of people assume that evolutionary psychologists think, well, that's the way all men and women are. And actually, no, it's not how all evolutionary psychologists are. Oh yeah, and it's a complete straw man when people say evolutionary psychology is just a rationalization for Victorian era gender norms. And say, men are this way and women are this way, and that's because of how things were in the caveman days. No, that's not how Sarah Blackford Hardy is. It's not how Helen Fisher is. It's not how Marlene Zuck is. Sometimes they'll say, well, some sort of stereotypically feminine behavior did provide an advantage for women in terms of being able to propagate their selfish genes to the next generation. And sometimes they will say that, sometimes they'll talk about, well, how stereotypically a feminine behavior helped women spread their genes from one generation to another. And sometimes they talk about how things are different. So now, for instance, Sarah Blackford Hardy doesn't say, well, all men just want to have sex with as many females as possible. She has a theory on how, on what could have incentivized men to be more monogamous, or to be more precise, what's incentivized our pre-Homo sapiens, our pre-Homo erectus, our hominid ancestors, from whence we came, to be more monogamous, males among them. And it goes something like this. Back then, there really was a Malthusian resource crisis for great apes. I mean, our ancestors, but you do see that in modern great apes too. So there are cases where, a band of chimpanzees do just eat up all the available food in another location, and they have to move to a new location. And if it's already the territory inhabited by another band of chimpanzees, they do have violent conflicts, sort of a war or a territorial dispute. Often, if they see chimps see one member of another band all by himself, they will gang up on him and they will literally rip his genitals off. They do that. They're very vicious. So, humans are often very cruel and violent, but see that in chimpanzees too, and it was likely in our common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees. And the bonobos are very similar to chimpanzees. People like to think that, well, they're always peaceful, they're like hippies, but no. Steven Pinker points out that when you examine bonobos in the wild, even they can exhibit violent behavior. But anyway, they're in a Malthusian resource crisis, so basically, they're as far as these primates are concerned, life is a zero-sum game where if your babies get more food, that's less for mine. So in that respect, infanticide is incentivized among great apes, where the male goes around killing the babies sired by other males. If he kills the babies, well, then they don't have to be fed, and that means there's more food available for his own babies. So Sargophagus Hardy says back then there would be male hominids going around killing the babies of other males. But there's a way to guard against that. What if genes, what if a male was born with genes that programmed him to stick around the female even after he had sex with the female and they had babies? What if he just stuck around and protected her? Well, again, we can think of it with the two foils, two different examples. There's negligent male and there's nurturing male. So negligent male is a Lothario. He just goes around trying to have sex with as many females as possible. When those females give birth to those babies, negligent male leaves them completely unattended. That's what evolutionary psychologists say men are supposed to do, right? Well, the consequence is that if he leaves all of his babies unattended, the mother isn't strong enough to defend them by herself. So rival males will come along and kill all the babies of negligent male. Negligent male therefore won't be able to propagate his genes across generations because he left all of his babies alone, vulnerable, and they were all murdered. So that's a dead end there. Now let's look at nurturing male. He's, because of genes, have emotionally predisposed him, have motivated him to stick around the female and protect her when murderous infanticide committing males come along. Nurturing male fends them off, he fights them off. As a consequence, his babies do live long enough to, they do grow into adults. And they do have babies of their own. Nurturing male's babies have the same genes as him, therefore they have the same genes that predispose him to be more nurturing is also in the males that he sired, and that goes on and on. So Sarah Blacker Hardy argues that at some point the negligent male genes became dwindled, became lesser and lesser, and what proliferated were males who were more like nurturing male, who were willing to stick around the female. And that's how, even if nurturing males ways was the alternative reproductive strategy, even if males who were like that were the minority, there could come a point where they become the majority. And if that's the case, that's when forming pair bonds, being monogamous, becomes the norm. That's when it becomes the mainline reproductive strategy. Conversely, contrary to the stereotype about evolutionary psychologists, it's not the case evolutionary psychologists think that females are always motivated to be monogamous. They're always going to stick with one male, because another strategy can form as well. So let's say mainline reproductive strategy for the female is to be monogamous or have sex only with one male. She forms a pair bond. There's a book called The Myth of Monogamy that talks about why, even though females might be more incentivized to be monogamous and stick with a male who will protect her, there can also be cases where she has genes that motivate her to have sex with other males as well. This is in a book called The Myth of Monogamy, and interestingly enough, it's written by a husband and wife team of psychologists. I think the Judith Eve Lipton is the name of one of them. If I'm mistaken, I apologize. And so they're a married couple of psychologists, and they write this book called The Myth of Monogamy. Are they polyamorous? Is that what's going on? I don't know. But that that reminds me. I like John Stossel. He's a great journalist. But when he interviewed them, he said something very inaccurate. He said it was a contradiction that they wrote this book called The Myth of Monogamy, and yet they've been married for years and years and years and years. And if you read the book cover to cover, you'll see that's not a contradiction at all. So this is what they say happens. They say the norm for humans and our ancestors is for them to form pair bonds. They form emotional pair bonds. They, quote, make house with one another, unquote. But it doesn't necessarily translate to sexual exclusivity, not merely on the male's part. It doesn't even translate to sexual exclusivity on the female's part. And the reason is something they call reproductive hedging. And it goes something like this. What if female is pair bonded with a nurturing male who will take care of her, but what if he's just not, his genes are not up to par? In another respect, his babies are they're not physically strong. Physically, they're not strong enough to survive. In that case, genetically, even though his behavior is good, genetically he might be a dud. So there might be an incentive to have sex with more than one male, to have sex with a male that might have genes that produce physically stronger babies. So let's say we have two females. We have we have loyal female and adulterous female. Loyal female follows mainline reproductive strategy. She's a stereotypical total monogamous female that that people think, and the one that is supposedly thought of as being the only model for females to follow by evolutionary psychologists. So she is very monogamous. She has sex with only one male, and the worries are true. His genes are he has genes that produce physically weak babies, and they die. In that case, loyal female won't be very successful in propagating her genes to the next generation, which means it makes her less successful in propagating whatever genes there are that cause a female to be completely loyal just to one mate. Now let's look at adulterous female, who her genes program her to do reproductive hedging. Remember, we're not talking about completely human. We're talking about like our ancestors of humans. There are, primates. They're ape-like. So an adulterous female does reproductive hedging, meaning she finds one male, she forms a pair bond with them, they make house with each other, and she has his babies. But also she has reproductive hedging. She, unbeknownst to that male, she will go off and have sex. Unbeknownst to her husband, quote, husband, unquote, she will go off and have sex with other males, and maybe she's impregnated by them. And what if they are physically stronger as a consequence of her having sex with males that have better genes in that regard than her husband? If that's the case, those babies will survive, and they will also carry the genes that she had possibly the genes that, quote, programmed her, unquote, to engage in reproductive hedging. And even if that doesn't catch on, even if that's not the main strategy in females, it could persist not to a large enough extent where it is carried on from generation to generation. In that case, monogamy model would be the mainline reproductive strategy, and reproductive hedging on the part of the female can be the alternative reproductive strategy. So you see how just because something's a norm, just because one adaptation is a norm, doesn't follow that there can't be other adaptations that are very different that help the owners of those adaptations survive and propagate their own genetic kind, their own genetic legacies and their own adaptations. And by the way, I guess you could say to counteract reproductive hedging on the part of adulterous female, that's also how sexual jealousy in males can emerge. That's how that can be incentivized. If like in an arms race, if there are too many females that are engaging in reproductive hedging, how can the quote husband make sure what's going to motivate the husband to make sure that the resources go to his babies and he's not a couple raising another male's babies? Well, sexual jealousy. And then I guess there are other things that can evolve in response to that too. But now let's talk about very consciously planned, very conscious human customs that are not genetically predetermined. That are folkways passed from generation to generation that are actually not genetically predetermined, but invented, and then which are taught from one generation to the next. Ethical codes count as that. Rules of morality are folkways, they're customs, and whether or not a clan adopts a specific set of rules about morality can influence whether that clan reproduces its babies and then in turn teaches its own moral rules to the next generation. Now I guess I should distinguish between the macro level and the micro level. Like Michael Shermer says that when it comes to very specific rules of morality, it can vary from one society to another. For example, like in Middle Eastern society, we have the rule against eating pork. This taboo against eating pork is considered a moral rule. If you eat pork, you're not just wrong. Their religion says you're evil if you do it. You're morally wrong. And in other societies, like in say Native Hawaiian culture, eating pork is considered acceptable, and that probably eating pork probably persisted in Native Hawaiian culture because it didn't have the same adverse environmental effects for them that it did for people in the Middle East who tried to raise pork. So there's variation in that respect. But Michael Shermer, the evolutionary psychologist and publisher of Skeptic magazine, will say, so those things are variable on the micro level. What about the macro level? On the macro level, very uniformly, every society is altruistic and collectivist in the macro level. On the general level, they'll disagree on specific rules like eating pork, but on the wide scale, the big picture scale, all of them will say that someone who sacrifices his own material wealth, his own happiness, his own life for the benefit of other people in the society is more impressive and morally praiseworthy than someone who peaceably serves his own self-interest. Okay, and many evolutionary psychologists go farther, such as Eric Michael Johnson. He's an anthropologist, and he very directly disparages Ayn Rand and the objectivist ethics. And this is how he does it. He does it in Scientific American magazine, and he did it on Slate.com. So he cites this anecdote told by the anthropologist Colin Turnbull, when Colin Turnbull lived among the Mbuti Pygmies, who are hunter-gatherers, of course, and they would go on hunts for a type of animal called a civet. It's a mammal. It looks like a raccoon or a lemur, and Mbuti Pygmies men would hunt together, hunt civets together, and then using their nets. And this is done collectively. You catch as many civets as you can with your nets. You bring them back to the clan, and then they're distributed relatively equally. That's often how hunting works, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's not always the case that meat is distributed equally. If there's a principle called sex for food, where the female will have sex with the male, and in return he gives her more meat. And in some clans, when the leader of the clan distributes meat, if you curry special favor with him, if you have sex with him, he might give you more meat, whereas if you irritate him, he might distribute less to you. So that's kind of like that sort of behavior you can see in modern politicians with the principle of pay to play, where they reward their friends and punish their enemies, where politician's rule is if you give him campaign contributions, then he's going to make sure that your business gets the contract with the city or state government or federal government. If you give him campaign contributions, you get the contract, and he pays you with tax money. Money he took from taxpayers. See, that's a kickback to you. And if you don't give him campaign contributions, you get nothing. Even if your firm is the most qualified for the job, he'll make sure the government doesn't hire you for that. I think that might be a carryover from when the leaders of hunter-gatherer clans, distribute meat according to who curries favor with them, and who denies meat to those who don't curry favor with them. But anyway, Colin Turnbull has this anecdote. The Mbuti Pygmies men are supposed to hunt all the civets, and some of them will catch more than others, but it's not the case that you catch more civets, you eat more civets. No, you're going to leave it to the elders to decide what quantity each party gets. So Colin Turnbull talks about one Mbuti Pygmy hunter in particular named Sefu. His name in writing it's spelled Cephu. I apologize if I pronounce it wrong. So Sefu is, according to Eric Michael Johnson, a selfish individualist. When Eric Michael Johnson retells Colin Turnbull's anecdote, Colin Turnbull tries to classify Sefu as the Ayn Rand hero type, the Howard Roark, the John Galt of the Mbuti Pygmy. And so what happens? What does Sefu do? He's sneaky, and he sets up a net in a specific place, so he's going to catch all the civets. In so doing, he's going to obstruct the other men from catching the civets. Then his plan is he's going to take all the civets and run away, and keep them and hog them all for himself. So he's cheating everyone else in what is supposed to be a collective enterprise. And what happened is that other males caught him before he could sneak away, and they bring him to a tribunal. Everyone gathers around, and they all pronounce their disapproval upon him. It's like a trial, and he's allowed to speak in his defense. And he says, "Well, I am the one who catches the most civets anyway. Therefore, why shouldn't I get to eat the most civets? So he's very boastful and arrogant. And then the elders tell him, well, it's not all about you. It's about all of us. So as punishment, we're going to take all the civets away from you. You're denied them, and then we're going to banish you. And that, for hunter-gatherers, that's just dangerous. Usually, like, if you're a hunter-gatherer clan and you're just banished from the clan, and you're all alone, you'll probably die. And, if it's not the case where, like, you can make contact with some people in the clan, the tribe, who are still individuals who are still sympathetic to you, no. If those people make contact with you, they will also face retribution. So you're sort of there's this enforced, they can be violently punished. So there's this violently enforced banishment of you. And Sefu was threatened with that. And then oh no, he suddenly becomes less boastful. He starts groveling for mercy. He says, no, 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 don't banish me. And then he gives all the civets hands them over to the elders. And then they took all the civets, and then they're eating it in front of him, and he gets nothing. And he clutches his belly, and he's so hungry, and he says, oh, please give me some. And then they ridicule him and mock him and laugh at him. Ha 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 ha. And it's only after he's completely humbled and humiliated, and he learns his lesson, they throw him a scrap. And so he's completely humiliated, and Eric Michael Johnson, the anthropologist, says, see, that is how capitalists are. The collective society does all the work, but the capitalists like Steve Jobs hogs most of the wealth. Just as Sefu wanted to hog all civets to himself, somehow someone like Steve Jobs gets to hog most of the money. So when you have someone like Steve Jobs or Johnny Rockefeller or Cornelius Vanderbilt, they get away. They succeed where Sefu failed. They succeed in stealing stuff that society created collectively, and Sefu didn't get away with it, but Johnny Rockefeller did. That's Michael Johnson's way of seeing the world. So he says, whoa, so because Sefu wanted to steal from everyone else, he follows Ayn Rand's theory of ethical egoism. He's a selfish individualist. He's the John Galt or hard work of the group. And that's complete straw man. But that's the impression Eric Michael Johnson wants you to get. So now I'm going to explain. So then Eric Michael Johnson says, so the Mabui Pygmies believe that, being a peaceable individual is being peaceful and minding your own business, serving your self-interest. At best, that's really perverse. At worst, it's really immoral, it's evil, and it has to be, if you're like that, you have to be destroyed. You have to face humiliation and destruction, same sort of destruction with which Sefu was threatened. And what's much more morally praiseworthy is, being collectivist, being willing to sacrifice your own interests for the good of the clan. And that's considered the moral norm. That's the altruist, collectivist, ethical norm. Their moral philosophy. And Eric Michael Johnson cites other anthropologists, and he says this idea of morality being the norm, that's uniform in all hunter-gatherer clans studied, past and present. What he cites is this guy who studied modern hunter-gatherer clans, which he thinks are very similar to hunter-gatherer clans of the past, of the Stone Age, because they're, so Eric Michael Johnson says, okay, so this idea that you should be an altruist, it's the notion that altruism is moral ideal. That's not congenital. You're not programmed to be that way. There will always be a minority of people who are like Sefu, who want to, cheat the rest of society and are therefore selfish. But he says something is congenital. What is congenital is that every society, the norm will be, most people will believe that being self-sacrificing for the sake of the collective society is better than peaceably serving your own self-interest and not hurting anybody else. Although you notice how Eric Michael Johnson wants to make this equivocation. He says, well, if you want to peaceably go your own way, do your own thing, that is stealing from everyone else. So he has this false dichotomy, this false binary system, where either you're a giver or a taker. There's no other option. Either you sacrifice yourself to others or you sacrifice others to yourself. It's like he never even read Ayn Rand for comprehension when he says that you're a taker like Sefu, well, then you're an Ayn Rand type. But that's actually sort of another argument for another day. So the idea is that it's not congenital for every single person to agree with the ethical idea that self-sacrifice is better than peacefully serving your own self-interest. But what is congenital, according to Eric Michael Johnson, is in every society, is congenital in every society, that the norm will be that the dominant ethical theory is that sacrifice it's better for someone to be self-sacrificing to the collective than to serve his or her own self-interest peaceably. So that's what I'm going to challenge right now in this segment. And I want you to notice something. Notice this equivocation where Eric Michael Johnson says, well, this is how the Mabui Pygmies are, this is how hunter-gatherer clans are, and we're going to apply this to the modern United States. United States, which is has 300 million people, which is industrialized, which is has a republic form of government, Republican form of government, and which is much more politically liberal. Again, not by liberal I don't mean welfare state, Democrat, socialist. I mean more laissez-fairist, more capitalist. That's what first people who are called liberal in a political context were for the more of a free market, like Richard Cobden, like Thomas Babington Macaulay. And this whole environment, the whole environment is different. And my argument is just because you think a collectivist moralist, a collectivist ethos might have helped pygmies propagate their genes and customs in the hunter-gatherer clans in the Stone Age, just because you think that sort of ethos helped propagate their genes and customs, it doesn't follow that we have to be like that. It doesn't follow that people in the modern United States, with a very different type of political economy, with a different size of society, with different technology, it doesn't follow we have to be like that. And that's the problem with many evolutionary psychologists. Earlier I said they talk about all these things that emerged during the Stone Age, that they say emerged as a consequence of gene culture coevolution in the Stone Age. They say things like sexual jealousy, even being violent, being violently competitive, men being violently competitive with another, wanting to punch out another guy, because you think he's hitting on your wife. Randy Thornhill, whom I cited earlier, he even thinks that men being very physically aggressive with women, being willing to rape, he thinks that might itself be a consequence of evolution. He thinks that that's an alternative reproductive strategy where if a man in Stone Age couldn't, get a woman to have sex with him consensually, the alternative reproductive strategy would be for him to resort to rape, and he could pass on his genes that way. And then, Randy Thornhill prefaces that with saying, just because I'm saying that is a behavior that might happen in the Stone Age, and that people doing it in modern times might be a consequence of that, it doesn't mean I think it's good that it happens in modern times. I don't think people ought to be doing that in modern times. But, a lot of radical feminists accuse him of rationalizing those things anyway. But, that's what social justice warriors do, really. You can't please them. But anyway, so evolutionary psychologists will talk about those behaviors and they'll say, well, just because hunter-gatherer clans are like that doesn't mean we have to be like that. Same thing with we talk about xenophobia. So well, hunter-gatherer clans are xenophobic. Doesn't mean we have to be like that. So they keep saying that, but they make an exception for altruism and collectivism. The general thrust is if on the macro scale, every hunter-gatherer clan is collectivist and thinks the individual should be sacrificed for the collective, they say, well, hunter-gatherer clans are like that. We should be like that. Besides, it's probably unavoidable because the norm is congenital. I'm here to say no. Just because hunter-gatherer clans were like that, it doesn't mean we have to be like that. That's not one way to explain. So, but basically, I've conceded already that the collectivist morals, having a generally altruist collectivist moral viewpoint, meaning what you think is moral is your moral view is that the individual sacrificing him or herself for other people, other entities, or society is more praiseworthy than peaceably serving your own self-interest. I said that maybe in Stone Age, maybe people having that feeling did help them. Did help them in warfare. Did help them win wars. Did help them have enough children that would grow up to become adults and have their own children. Maybe it did help them propagate both their genes, and in turn, the custom itself was perpetuated across generations. I think maybe that did help. So maybe collectivist ethos was an adaptation that helped the selfish gene for human beings in the Stone Age. But I'm going to argue, if that's the case, then that was the mainline reproductive strategy in kin selection. Now I'm going to argue that that was not an individualist ethos, but that has things in common with Ayn Rand's ethical theory, even though it's not as sophisticated. We argue that even ever since the Stone Age, there emerged an alternative reproductive strategy, which was to have a more individualistic ethos, more in line with Ayn Rand, and more implicitly with Ayn Rand's point of view, even though I would say that it's not perfectly objective, it's not perfectly Randian ethical egoism, because that wasn't fleshed out fully until Ayn Rand came along and articulated all of it. But I'm going to say that even before Ayn Rand was born and talked about all of this, to the degree that our society has ascended beyond the Stone Age hunter-gatherer clan model, it was because there were people who had sort of implicitly an approach that was much more implicitly in line with what Ayn Rand is in favor of. I'm going to call it that, the individualist ethos. I'm going to say that that is also a custom, a mores, a folkways, an evolutionary adaptation, and that helps people, survive, help them survive long enough to have kids, even help them in raising their kids and grandkids. And I'm going to say that that is an alternative reproductive strategy. And I don't think it's impossible that that could become the mainline reproductive strategy in a free society, in a free liberal Republican society. So here goes. I think that in the rational faculty is inherently individualistic because, I often hear science fiction fans use the term hive mind, and this is a contradiction in terms. No sapient mind is hive-like. There are hives in existence, bees have hives, but they don't have a mind. They don't have a sapient mind. They run on genetic programming. They don't have volition, they don't make decisions, they can't even feel pain. They don't have the nerves that enable them to feel pain. Vertebrates are capable of feeling pain, but not creatures that live in hives. When you use your mind and you make rational long-term decisions, it's inherently independent because you can't read someone else's mind, not literally. We don't have telepathy, we don't have ESP. You can't read someone else's mind. I can't psychically project my own thoughts into your head, unless I use the physical senses, like unless I open my mouth so you can hear me speak. I can share my thoughts with you, but I have to decide that independently. So we can cooperate with one another. I can choose to speak and you can choose to listen, but again, that's an individual choice that you make. And I can choose to keep secrets. I can choose not to speak to you. I can choose to keep my ideas to myself. And then I'll have thoughts in my head and they won't be shared. See, so your mind is the ultimate form of privacy. When you think thoughts in your head and you don't share them with anyone else, that's the ultimate privacy, the privacy of your own mind. And because there is no hive mind, this can't be shared collectively. So when you think for yourself, that is the start of individualism, that's the start of independence. Even and living in a society and talking with other people and sharing your ideas and cooperating, none of that takes away from the independence of thinking thoughts in your own head and the privacy of your own mind. And on a physical level, independent thinking is redundant. Because even if I was total conformist and I believed everything, the popular people told me and I agreed with all of them and didn't mull over it, I didn't intellectually chew on it, I didn't try to test it, even though I just accepted all these stupid things people say at face value, it would be up to me as an individual unit, as an independent physiological being, to make that choice. So even there, on a physical level, the thinking is independent, even though it's not, it's not sufficient for the conducive good life, which I'm going to talk about. But that's the start of independence, and the start of individualism. And that's also the start of egoism too, thinking for yourself. And I'm going to explain how that emerged. Okay, so earlier I talked about how the human brain kept getting bigger and bigger, so much so that there came a point where it was difficult for the fetus's head to fit through the birth canal. Many evolutionary psychologists actually try to give credit to living in community. They say, well, you know how chimpanzees are very manipulative, they're very political, where one male will try to form alliances with other males, and then they'll gang up on the alpha male and overthrow him so that the leader of the cabal becomes an email. They're very political and scheming that way. And they're so collectivist. And then evolutionary psychologists like to say, well, that's how our human ancestors were too. So living in a community and scheming for dominance is what caused the brain to get bigger and bigger. And my response to that is maybe that's what happened in the beginning. But there came a point where having a big brain was about more than living in a community. It's about so much more than trying to manipulate other people. So let's talk about how the brains got big. This is the prevailing theory. Off the top of my head, I can't name all my sources, but I do list them in the book. So our ancestors lived in trees. They ate all the fruit growing on the trees. But climate changed by itself, not because of industrialists, but climate change by itself. And the environment changed, and there came a point where there wasn't enough vegetation to eat in the trees. So what happened was our ape-like ancestors had to climb out of the trees and had to migrate to where there was food. So they jumped out of the trees and began walking to another forest where they could climb into other trees and eat the fruits there. And sometimes they have to walk very long distances. And if that's the case, normal way that apes walked wasn't sufficient. Great apes are knuckle walkers, meaning with the forelimbs, they walk on their knuckles. And likely our hominid ancestors did the same. And when they first got out of trees and began migrating, that was a big problem because that uses up a lot of energy for them. It makes them tired very quickly. That's why modern great apes like orangutans, they don't spend that much time on the ground because walking on the ground is too much work for them. It's easier for them to stay in a tree. But what if some mutation happened that caused the hominid ancestors to walk on two limbs alone, just on the hind limbs? That saves a lot of energy for them. So basically what happened was, among our ancestors, there's knuckle walkers who will always walk on four limbs when on the ground, and the mutant weirdos who began walking on their hind legs alone when they were on the ground. Knuckle walkers don't complete the journey from one place to another. They get too tired and they die. They don't have babies, or their babies, they do have babies, but the babies don't live long enough to reach adulthood. So the knuckle walkers are dead end. They die, and they don't propagate genes that make them knuckle walkers. So the ones who would migrate from one forest to another on two legs, they're the ones who they do make it to the next place. They survive, they have babies, and pass on the genes. And what happened was, because their form of locomotion saved energy, the energy could go to other places. The energies went, instead of energy being used in their walking, the energy went to feeding their brains, making their brains larger. The calories went to making the brains larger. And then there's another one. There's also another theory. Now let's go to Homo erectus. Oh yeah. Okay, so here's another one. This theory is from William Calvin, a neuroscientist. He said that he's very big on the Kyoto Protocol. He wants, he thinks that you don't spread the Kyoto Protocol, you're evil and you're for extinction of the species. But that's funny because he says that it was in climate change and climate being very variable in the Stone Age that helped make our brains so large in the first place, so adaptable. He says that humans are very adaptable, and the climate changed a lot. So we had to, and because humans weren't just inherently physically adapted to all these different terrains, they had to make themselves adaptable. They had to, create tools and things like that to survive. And so the adaptation was, instead of just them having a inborn physiological trait, making them adaptable to different climate extremes like the hot heat in the desert or extreme cold temperatures in places like Alaska. Instead, they developed a bigger brain. The ones who survived and had kids were the ones who had bigger brains. that help them exercise a rational faculty to restructure and to take materials from the environment around them and restructure these materials to create tools that help them survive. And finally, there's another one, meat. Meat. um, so great, like chimpanzees crave meat, and our ancestors did too. And I think this leaves a lot of people who talk about the paleo diet, they get this false impression. But basically, our ancestors, they just love the taste of meat. And you can see that in chimpanzees too, where like sometimes a baby chimpanzee will wait underneath his or her parents for hours and hours and hours when his parents are eating meat, just because there's a slight chance a drop of blood from the meat, when the parents are eating messily, there's a slight chance a drop of blood will fall away from what the parents are eating, and in that case, the baby will just lick that up. That's how much chimps and our ancestors loved meat. Just because they love meat, it doesn't follow they got to eat a lot of it. It's the other way around. Basically, theory Marlene Zug talks about. There's a theory is that the reason why like humans are not as impressed by a taste of grains, or high fiber foods. The reason is because there was a lot of it around them, so they just ate it, just to survive. No question. But things like fruits and meat was much harder to come by. So the idea is that it's exactly because they had such a hard, they didn't have much access to fruits. Fruits had chemicals in it that were good for them, but they didn't come by fruits so easily. So the idea is that some mutation occurred that made humans attracted to the taste of sweet things such as fruits. So it goes like this. So we have non-sweet tooth and sweet tooth. Non-sweet tooth is genetically programmed not to crave sweet tastes of sweet tastes, such as the taste of fruit. And then sweet tooth is genetically programmed by its genes care about sweet things. It just loves the taste of sweet stuff like fruits. Well, non-sweet tooth comes across fruits, doesn't like them, so doesn't eat a lot of them, so he doesn't get all the chemicals he needs to survive, and he dies. Or if he does have kids, they die before, his kids inherit his non-sweet tooth genes, so they don't eat a lot of fruits. They don't get the chemicals they need. They die. So there's that dead end. And then we have the side that's genetically programmed to crave states of sweetness. When they do come across fruits, they eat it. They like the taste, so they try to get as much as they can. They search for it. They forage for it. Those are the ones who do survive long enough to have kids. Their kids inherit the same sweet tooth genes. They raise those kids to adulthood, and so the genes go on and on. And that's why modern people just love the taste of sweet stuff. And now it sort of works against us because now we have lots of candy that has sweet taste, and it fattens us in a way that the fruits never would have fattened cavemen, our ancestors. But basically the idea is that sweet food was very good for our cavemen. It could have been very unhealthy for them if they ate too much sugar, but sugar was so hard for them to come by. By contrast, sugar is very easy for us to come by. We still love the taste, so we eat a lot of it and we get fat. See, that's another example of how just because something helped benefit our species through kin selection and Stone Age, it doesn't follow that is always beneficial to us in the modern times. There's a similar principle with meat, where it wasn't easy for hominids to get meat. It's not easy for chimps to get meat. But eating meat is actually good for you. It has lots of protein. It has lots of chemicals in it that are good for you. So again, let's have like totally anti-meat, so anti-meat primate over here, and we have meat craving primate over here. If the ones who are genetically predisposed not to like a taste of meat, they're not going to get as much chemicals they need, so those guys die off, or the kids die off before they, kids die off before they can have their own kids. So that there's that dead end. And again, the chimps that are genetically predisposed to like meat will go searching for meat. They go hunting. They eat the meat. They get the chemicals they need. They have kids, raise kids to adulthood, and kids inherit the craving, the love for meat. So that goes on and on. But again, they didn't overeat meat because they just didn't have much access to it. The contrast, in our modern times, we have more access to meat. So I can overeat meat and indulge. If I feel like eating lots of meat, I can. And I can go overboard on that. By contrast, my ancestors who also love the taste of meat, the craving of meat motivated them to go searching for meat, to go hunting and get some meat. But once they did have access to meat, it wasn't like they could just indulge in it a lot. See, so if a paleo person says, our ancestors love the taste of meat and therefore it's good if we eat a lot of it, that's not necessarily the case. But basically what happened was Homo erectus went hunting for meat. And this is before our own species. Our species is Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo erectus came before that. What happened was Homo erectus invented fire. And that was a form of technology. That was a method of taking something from the wilderness that was previously untouched by man and then applying it to serve man's needs. Creating fire was an early form of technology, and it was done before our species evolved, because it was done by Homo erectus, not us, Homo sapiens. And that actually means that technically technology is older than our species. Our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, has never been without technology. Therefore, it's misleading to say technology is unnatural. Like anything that's non-technological is natural, and anytime we use technology that's unnatural, that's completely misleading, because our species has never done without technology. We've always had it. It is our evolutionary adaptation. It's how we survive. That's another folkway that helped us through kin selection. Therefore, technology is human nature, at least of our species. Using technology is the nature of Homo sapiens sapiens. It is inherent to who we are, what we are. So the next time someone says to you, oh, that form of technology is unnatural, respond, no, technology is human nature. It is the exercise of human nature. Therefore, in that respect, it is not unnatural. If you start making this distinction between saying, well, the wilderness is natural and our technology is unnatural, you should just say, well, that's the wilderness not touched by humans, and that's natural. And then we have technology that is touched by humans, that is artificial, created by humans, and that too is natural. It's consistent with the laws of nature, it's consistent with principles of nature. We use our understanding of natural law, like law of gravitation, to use technology, to create technology. So really, technology is not unnatural. It is our manipulation of what is natural for our own purposes. So no, anything that exists is not unnatural. So anyway, Homo erectus discovered fire, how to make fire, and that actually helps the growth of the brain, because when the meat was burned, the meat was cooked, and then cave people ate, Homo erectus ate that meat, they required a lot less calories, fewer calories to consume all of that food. So where the extra calories go, it went to the growth of the brain. So, and with the growth of the brain came the rational faculty, and that's what helps long-term decision making. Like with other vertebrates, like reptiles, other types of mammals, like mice, they can go by whim. They follow their whims. Like and that works in the short run. Like why do you think sex is physically pleasurable? Again, that's a consequence of natural selection. Let's say we have two vertebrates of the same species, but because of mutations, they're different. This one is a anti-sex vertebrate and pro-sex vertebrate. Anti-sex vertebrate has genes that make it so that if he or she has sex, it's not physically pleasurable. So he or she just doesn't do it that much. And so because anti-sex vertebrate doesn't get anything up, doesn't feel good from having sex. Anti-sex vertebrate doesn't have sex and therefore doesn't have offspring, and dies without having a lot of babies. And because of that, those genes that prevent anti-sex vertebrate from experiencing pleasure from sex, they're not transmitted to future generations. By contrast, pro-sex vertebrate, because of some mutation, he or she does experience pleasure when having sex. And in that case, he or she wants more. He or she has sex, and therefore it has babies. Those babies inherit the genes so that they too will experience pleasure when having sex, and they'll seek it out for the sake of experiencing pleasure. So you see how feeling good from having sex is a consequence of natural selection. So, and that's evolutionary psychology. When you try to dismiss evolutionary psychology, you're denying things like that. You're denying conclusions like that. So, and basically, if it feels good, eat it. So lots of reptiles, amphibians, mammals, just mice, they just go by whim. You can see that they're very there are like pack animals like wolves. They're very emotional. You can detect emotions. You can tell when the dog is happy or when the dog is scared, things like that. So when it comes to short-term decisions, you can just go by whim. But with our species, we're different. We're not as physically strong. We're not as fast like cheetahs. We're not as physically strong as elephants. So the mind is our adaptation. Our mind, changing nature, reshaping the materials to create tools. That's technology. That's our adaptation. And there comes a point where that requires long-term planning, where, like, for instance, what if I'm hungry, I'm in the woods and I'm hungry, and I see mushrooms, and I think, well, I ate mushrooms before, and I was nurtured, so I'm going to eat these mushrooms too. They look a bit different, they're different color and everything, but I'm sure things will turn out fine. Well, there are lots of toxic mushrooms, so if you eat the wrong kind of mushrooms, you can die, you get poisoned and die. So, there comes a point where just going by your whims isn't good enough, where you have to think of what happens in the long run, where you have to make plans for the long run, like building shelter. When a group of primitive humans build a shelter, they have to make long-term plans. When they're engaged in farming, they have to make long-term plans. There's some seasons. They have to deal with pests eating their crops. They have to deal with things like irrigation. that requires long-term planning. And whims don't help you with long-term planning, because sometimes if you just follow your whims, something might feel good in the immediate moment and have bad consequences later on. Like if I go by whims and I'm hungry and I see some mushrooms that look weird and I eat them, that can have bad long-term consequences. So there comes a point where you have to do long-term planning, and that's where the rational faculty comes in. That's where you use your imagination and you think, well, first of all, you draw causal connections. You think, and you realize, you recognize cause and effect, where if I eat these types of mushrooms, people eat these types of mushrooms, they feel fine later on. By contrast, when they eat these other mushrooms of this like orange color, these orange mushrooms, often they get sick later. They feel terrible later, and some of them die. Therefore, eating one type of mushroom causes you to feel well fed. By contrast, eating these orange mushrooms will cause you to feel sick and possibly die. And then long-term planning involves imagining. When you make these you induce these causal connections, then you can use your imagination to to consider the consequences of your choices. Like, well, what if I eat these gray mushrooms that when people eat these, they don't have ill effects? I imagine myself eating them, and if I imagine that if I react to them the same way as other people do, then I'll be fine. By contrast, if I eat these orange mushrooms, I've observed people eating these orange mushrooms and then being sick and dying. Well, if I am like those other people in the pertinent respects, that means that I can imagine myself eating those orange mushrooms, and I anticipate, well, I could get sick and die like them. So in my long-term plan, I'm going to eat the gray mushrooms, and I'm going to avoid eating the orange mushrooms. That's a relatively simple one. People make more and more complex plans. They learn how to make stone tools. They could look at animal tracks on the ground, and they could tell what kind of type of animal those tracks. And they could have meetings where they would decide, where the elders would argue about whether they should move to one place or another or stay where they are, things like that. But you see, of course, as I said earlier, you can choose to share your knowledge by speaking. So you can go to a village meeting and choose to share your knowledge by telling everyone else your thoughts. But you can also just keep your thoughts in your head and not share them with anyone. Your rational thoughts in your head. That sort of privacy is inherent. And that's one area where individualism starts, where you can disagree with what other people say, even with what the elders say, with what the majority says. If your society says one thing, you can think, well, I observed something different, and I'm going to behave differently from what they want. I guess you could say Sefu was like that. And in most cases, if you are an independent thinker in a hunter-gatherer clan, and you didn't have an exalted position like witch doctor or shaman or medicine man, you weren't in that kind of exalted position, and you thought for yourself, normally you were struck down, normally you were punished, you were ostracized or killed or violently killed, just as Sefu was threatened with banishment. So a lot of times that individual trying to act independently, act on your own independent thinking, for a long time that was suppressed. For tens of thousands of years during the Stone Age. But there had to come a point where there were cases where independent thinking triumphed, where people invented something new, they thought of some type of social change, and somehow people went along with it. And I think you can see an example of that with farming. Uh, the anthropologist Louis Binford thinks that this came about from a sort of Malthusian crisis, where ideas that people were farming, hunter-gatherers started farming plants before they decided that farming would be their main source of food. So the idea is that these people were sort of in this transitional period where they still hunted animals for food and they still foraged for plants to eat, but somehow some independent thinker noticed that you could plant seeds from plants and you could raise, and then the seedlings would grow and you could raise plants yourself. And there came a point where these people were sedentary, they stayed in one place, but they still chose to hunt for food. In the book, I explained how anthropologists came up with the theory that um, how anthropologists when they looked at the teeth on deer that were hunted by ancient peoples like the Natufians, they decided that what happened was these people became sedentary, staying in one place, and yet they were still hunters, and they weren't mostly getting their food from farming. But basically, in this transitional period, people learned how to farm with plants, but they didn't consider farming their main source of food. Um, uh, you know, raising horticulture was sort of a diversion, it's sort of a hobby. They're called hunter horticulturalists. But Louis Binford's theory is that eventually the Malthusian crisis happened. The hunter horticulturalists depleted all the resources. They hunted animal species to extinction, and there was nothing left to hunt. So the people were starving, and most of the clans were like this died off. But eventually, someone in some clan recognized, hey, what if now farming is our main source of food? Probably it started with horticulture. Some theories are that the domestication of dogs was sort of co-evolved with people being hunters, where well, you can read about that in Stephen Viviansky's book, Coven of the Wild. But anyway, there came a point where humans, it wasn't practical for these people to hunt, get their food mostly from hunting anymore. And so they had to bite the bullet, not literally, but they had to face up that they had to have another main source of food. And that's when they switched to farming being their main source of food. And it wasn't an easy transition, it was a very long transition. And Jared Diamond talks about all these disadvantages just making that switch, and he tries to make it sound as if there was a net loss there, or wouldn't it have been so much better if we never resorted to that? So I can see that there were these disadvantages to switching to farming and starting to have these big cities, but I still argue that in the long run there was a net benefit to that, where people today living alive today are better off as a consequence of the switch to farming. We're better off than we would have been if they never made that switch, our ancestors never made that switch. So, and earlier I talked about another thing. So people began to live in big cities, and the family unit changed. The family was no longer the whole community because the community was too big for that. So people split off into separate households, where the household was mostly a man and a woman and the children. And sometimes they had extended family in the household too, but basically the household was smaller, people separated themselves into houses, and even though they were still a community, notice how they had much more privacy this way now. And when you have more privacy, that contributes to more individualism. Now, people in households can think differently from other people. So you and I might be in one household, and we all agree with each other on things, we have consensus, but we have neighbors who live in a different household. And because they have privacy, they can come to different conclusions different from us. So that too contributed to more individualistic thinking.
Also, increasingly became closer and closer to having ideas about private property. And hunter-gatherer clans have sort of an idea of private property too. They're not 100% communist. They're mixed economies. Like even like very collectivist hunter-gatherer clans are mixed economies. They're not perfectly communist. They have both um, collectivist elements and they have some individualistic commercial elements, such as the inter-tribal, inter-clan trade, things like that. But I argue that those clans are still too collectivist for my taste. They're more collectivist than we are, And even though the United States is a hunter-gatherer clans are a mixed economy, and the United States is a mixed economy too. So neither is perfectly individualist or perfectly communist. But you can look at degrees, and relatively, the United States is much more individualistic than our hunter-gatherer clans, and I'm going to explain how that came to be. So also farming societies advanced more in private property. Now, collectivist hunter-gatherer clans had private property too, but they didn't take it as seriously, because they're nomadic. They move from place to place. They travel light. If you're a nomad and you move from place to place, you have to travel light. The Kunsan, the Kalahari Bushmen, it's not like they have a wagon train or anything. They don't have caravan full of supplies. It's just people walking. So they travel light. So sometimes they can form stone tools or other tools from branches, things like that. But the idea is that, and you can think of that as their private property. When I'm using this tool, other people are not using it. So when I'm using this tool, it's mine alone. But they didn't take it very seriously. They had to travel light. So normally these things were abandoned. People would make tools. They're always makeshift tools. You make the tool for a short while, and it's your private property for a short while, and then when it's time for you to move, you just abandon it. And also, because the idea of private ownership of land was a very foreign concept to them, since they were nomads and they kept moving all the time. Now, when we switch to hunter-horticultural societies, and they're in a fixed place, they come closer to having an idea of private ownership in real estate, in land. But even their idea of private property isn't like the modern idea of private property. Basically, the idea is, okay, this is our clan owns this land, or maybe the land owns us. But the point is, we're sort of fixed to this land, and it's not just the people who are alive who should have control over this land. It's also the case that it's private property of our ancestors, our dead ancestors. The spirits of our ancestors are dead, but their spirits are still with us. Therefore, they should have a say over what happens to the land too. So a patriarch would often have like a shaman or a priest, a medicine man, or a witch doctor. He'd have that an advisor in that, and witch doctor would pretend to speak to the ancestors and ask for their advice on what should be done with the land. And they also thought the land was the property of their descendants who were not even yet born. So they said we have to consider, what happened. When we do something with the land, we have to consider their input too. So and as you can imagine, that cycled things a lot. If some guy pretending to speak to your ancestors can veto what you want to do with your own land, you can't get very far. But eventually, the ancient Sumerians, Mesoamericans, they gained more sophisticated ideas of private property. But of course, again, it's not like the modern idea. They had this idea that only people born to a specific family should have control over the land. So that's when we get to ideas more like in feudalism, where, well, these guys are born to this caste, and therefore they get to control the land, And if you're not born into that caste, then you don't get to have control over the land. You know, so one caste people, several higher castes monopolize control over the land, and not even they have full, or thought by the governments, they don't have full authority to do whatever they want with that land. If you inherit control over a plot of land from your parents, from your father, really, because man had all control. Um, you can inherit control over the land from your father. You're still bound by these other rules. There's like they say, well, even though the land's supposed to be yours, you can do this with it, this and this, but not this. You know, and like those regulations over what you can do with your own land, those even passed on. Like in England, even in England in the 1700s and 1800s, they still had rules like that. This notion that you should be able to peaceably do whatever you want on your own plot of land and it's your private property, doesn't belong to dead people, doesn't belong to your future people, it only belongs, your descendants, only belongs to you. That's a pretty recent idea. It's a very American idea, not very European. It's very American, not even English. Like English are thought of as being like revolutionizing the modern idea of capitalism, but no, this notion that you own your land outright and should be able to do what you want with it. That's a relatively recent idea. It's no more than 300 years old. But anyway, even though the agricultural peoples didn't have a sophisticated understanding of private property as we do, they were getting closer and closer to there, and that also encouraged a more individualistic ethos. Now we get to ancient Greece. Now, politically, they're very collectivist, including Aristotle. Aristotle is very collectivist. You know, he says, Aristotle and Cicero say, you know, they outright ask the question, does your life belong to you? Do you belong to yourself? They say, nope, nope, you belong to the city. You know, and if you think that your life belongs to you, if you want to mind your own business and not participate in civic affairs, yeah, you're a bad guy. You don't deserve to live. Even Aristotle and Cicero said that. But I've been told that they didn't mean it in exactly the same way as Chairman Mao or Hitler did. Chairman Mao and Hitler also said, yeah, your life doesn't belong to you, it belongs to society. But Aristotle and Cicero weren't as extreme as those guys, because when Hitler and Mao say your life doesn't belong to you, it belongs to society, what they mean is, if you think your life belongs to you and you do your own thing, well, Hitler and Mao are going to kill you. By contrast, when Aristotle and Cicero say your life doesn't belong to you, what they really mean is if you're going to be a recluse and not participate in civic affairs, they're really going to strongly look down upon you, and you have their utmost contempt. But I think Aristotle, if you're like a big landowner trying to mind your own business and not participate in civic affairs, I think Aristotle and Cicero aren't going to say, well, you should be killed. You know, even though Aristotle and Cicero, they were pretty brutal about some things. You know, Aristotle did think slavery, at least debt slavery, he thought that was perfectly okay or natural. Well, the point is that he wasn't outraged about it. But anyway, even though the ancient Greeks were rather collectivist, I mean, they did have a merchant class. You know, there was a merchant peoples, and allowing people to be merchants, trade, provide for themselves and their families alone. That's more individualistic. But for the most part, though, the ancient Greeks the Athenians weren't as individualistic as I would like, But even though they weren't politically individualistic, they were getting more and more psychologically individualistic. That is according to a German scholar named Bruno Snell. This is what he means by it. He says you can tell there was more and more psychological individualism among the ancient Greeks because you can see signs of it in their poetry. Because poetry. There was poetry before there was ancient Greeks. You know, like the ancient Sumerians had poetry. You know, what you could say the oral histories told by hunter-gatherers. Those are poetry. Those are poetic. Because when they sometimes when they give oral histories, they would recite the oral history in a musical sort of way. You know, the rhythm, beat. You know, they would sing the oral histories. So poetry was very old. But poetry was basically sort of a public thing. It was for the public interest. The idea is that the poet's job is a civic job where if you're a poet, you have to, when you recite poetry, when you write poetry and you recite it, it's part of a ritual that happens with society as a political ritual whereby you sing the praises of society as a whole, or you sing the praises of the gods. You're not doing this for you. You're not expressing yourself. You're expressing the will, supposedly expressing the will of society as a whole, or expressing the will of the gods or spirits. But Bruno Sell says that trend changed with ancient Greeks. He talks about poets like Sappho. I think she's a woman. I think Sappho's a woman. And poets like Sappho, they're different because in ancient Greece, still a lot of times poetry was very political, where poet's job was to go to some big ceremony and then sing the praises of you know, politicians or well political people who had political influence, or sing praises of gods, things like that. But Sappho was different. She used poetry to express her own feelings, her own priorities, her own thoughts. And in our modern times, that seems like no big deal. That's what poets always do, right? Not in ancient Greece, not in ancient times. Sappho doing that was revolutionary. It was completely innovative. Very few poets dared to do something like that. You see, when people are these poets expressing themselves, their own personal feelings, the implication there is that your own personal thoughts and feelings matter. You're not just some cog in the machine. You're not just some unit. I mean, you're not just some small little polyp on a greater coral reef. You are a unit unto yourself, and your own thoughts and feelings deserve expression. That's the implication of what poets like Sappho were doing. And then came the ancient Romans. The ancient Romans conquered the Greeks. They started off as very barbaric and more primitive than the Greeks. They conquered the Greeks militarily, and they eventually took on many ancient Greek institutions. They took the gods and gave them their own names. But and the Romans had a legal system, you know, and they used the term republic, which means res public, having to do with the public property. But even then, they weren't as collectivist as communism is supposed to be. You know, Cicero came along, and Cicero was actually more of a laissez-faire, came closer to arguing for laissez-faire capitalism than Aristotle did. Aristotle was more came closer to capitalism than Plato, because Plato was for total communism, total government control over land, and Aristotle gave a utilitarian argument against that. He said, no, if one person or family is given exclusive control over this plot of land, they're going to they have more of an incentive to take care of it than if some impersonal, distant government ruler controls all the land and is supposed to make decisions for the supposed benefit of the people as a whole. Aristotle was more capitalist, closer to capitalist than Plato, but Cicero came closer to being a modern laissez-faire capitalist than Aristotle did. He said, even though he said, yeah, your life belongs to the state, city-state, and not to you, he did say, he sort of contradicted himself there. He said, well, what is the purpose of government? The government should be to protect you and your private property from the initiation of use of physical force. The government should be there to protect you from violence. Other people shouldn't be able to use violence against you. More than that, they shouldn't be able to use force to steal your property. They shouldn't be able to, if you're a farmer and you're growing crops, or you're raising cattle, or whatever animals one's raised. But marauders shouldn't just be able to come and take your stuff, take the fruit of your labor. The government should protect your private property from theft, things like that. So we see how in practice people are becoming more individualistic gradually over time. Of course, then the Dark Ages happened, and I would argue that that was a big step back. And I would argue that, because in ancient Greece, people, they weren't politically individualistic, they were so politically collectivist. But I mean, there was more and more independence, first with poets, and then with philosophers, where philosophers could argue with each other, they could argue against the government. And they could say, I don't agree with you. Like when there's a story of the philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. But one day he was just in a public square, sprawled out. He was a very boorish guy, sprawled out, sunning himself. And then Alexander the Great approached him. And then the first thing Diogenes said to Alexander the Great is, "You're in my sun. Stand out of my sunshine." You know. And Alexander the Great didn't kill him. He actually admired Diogenes. So in ancient Greek culture, increasingly you could be a philosopher and you could debate against the government, you could debate against other philosophers, you could think for yourself. And people didn't find that morally abhorrent in the way they found Cephu moral. The pygmies found Cephu morally abhorrent. Increasingly, people had more and more of an idea of private property, though not to the extent of that I would like. But then, of course, the Dark Ages happened. Rome became a very Christian theocracy. I would argue that it became that was a step backward, and I would argue that it became much less individualistic than were the ancient Greeks. And I would argue that as a consequence of that, progress slowed down. Now and many philosophers from the Enlightenment would agree with that. Edward Gibbon would agree with that. But now there's this whole movement of apologists for the Middle Ages, medieval apologists, where they say, well, if you think the Dark Ages was a time of when progress slowed down, you're just a victim of the propaganda from the philosophers of the Enlightenment. There was a lot of progress during the Middle Ages because, that's when they invented stirrups. The ancient Greeks didn't have stirrups. And it's true that there were many inventions in there, not many. There were inventions during the Middle Ages, progress didn't halt completely. There was some progress. But I would argue that it was much slower than it should have been. And had they not been such a Christian theocracy, especially in the early Middle Ages, I think, progress would have occurred at a faster rate. So as far as I'm concerned, the Dark Ages still are the Dark Ages. Sorry, medieval apologists. It's not a coincidence that most medieval apologists are conservative, very religious. There are atheistic medieval apologists too, but they sound like cultural conservatives. They play by the religious rights rules. But anyway, whether medieval apologists are religious or atheistic, I think that when they cite the technological progress that occurred in the early Middle Ages, the examples they cite are still very weak. Still very weak. It's not good enough. Even though there was progress, it was slower than it should have been. The economist Charles Kinney points out he points out in his books how slow progress was during the Middle Ages, especially the early Middle Ages. When Augustine was the early church fathers are dominant. Around the High Middle Ages, around 1200, when there were philosophers like Peter Abelard and St. Thomas Aquinas. I think that's really when there was progress. Even then, it was still too slow, but there was more progress. I would say more progress in the High Middle Ages than in the Early Middle Ages. It has a lot. I think it has to do with the theologians of the High Middle Ages being acquainted with Aristotle again. Like I think in Spain or in Spain in the Early Middle Ages, they noticed a lot of what Aristotle said contradicted Christianity. Thought he was a pagan, so Spain banned him for a long time. But around the High Middle Ages, they became more liberal about that. But I think the monks and scholastics, they became more liberal about that, and people could read, the priests could read Aristotle, and you wouldn't be punished for reading Aristotle. But of course, they sorry about mispronunciation. They bowdlerized, or they sanitized Aristotle and tried to make him. They tried to they ignored Aristotle's many contradictions against church doctrine. They took what they liked and tried to be syncretist and merge it with church doctrine. And I think that the rediscovery of Aristotle, even though it wasn't perfect, they gained renewed respect for reason. And as I said, like reasoning, doing long-term decision making, is inherently individualistic. So I think individualism gained. But when individualism really took off was in the Renaissance period. And then you had philosophers like Francis Bacon and Pierre Gassendi, where they talked about the importance of inductive reasoning. Actually, Aristotle talked about inductive reasoning too, but I think that the treatises where he talked about the importance of inductive reasoning, they weren't well known among philosophers of the Renaissance, such as Francis Bacon. They knew about Aristotle talking about deductive logic, but I think they weren't very knowledgeable about Aristotle talking about inductive reasoning. So when philosophers of the Enlightenment, like Francis Bacon and Galileo talked about inductive reasoning, I think they thought they were actually contradicting Aristotle. They said, well, unlike Aristotle, I favor inductive reason. They didn't know Aristotle did favor inductive reason. But the point is that during the Renaissance, church doctrine wasn't as strong. I mean, it was still church. The Pope was still very politically powerful, and stuff like that. But I mean, it became more this worldly, focused on more practical reason, practical reality. So you didn't just have to think about the afterlife all the time. You did still think about the afterlife a lot, but increasingly you're allowed to think about a practical reality, life on this earth. And they focus on inductive reasoning. And because you reason in the privacy of your own mind, and you can withhold expressing your thoughts from other people, the more inductive reasoning is encouraged, I think the more individualism is encouraged, more psychological individualism. And more, if people think for themselves, the consequence will be that they won't just think in the privacy of their own minds, they're going to be individualistic in their actions, they're going to act on their own interests, and be willing to contradict what the majority of society says. They're more willing to contradict even what the government says, even if it's a theocracy or absolute monarchy or totalitarianism, or even if you have a communist government or a Nazi government. But of course, when you have a totalitarian government, they try to suppress independent thinking. And often they do succeed in silencing people. So the more you liberalize the government, the more people think freely, more independent thinkers. The more liberalized the government is, more independent thinkers will be willing to act on their independent thoughts and produce practical results in reality, and not often results in commerce, in entrepreneurship, in invention. It's no accident that Renaissance is when inventions began to take off, and it was during the Renaissance when they took patents more and more seriously, and many opponents of intellectual property will say, well, patents um, originally meant, you know, a monarch giving a monopoly to his crony and making it illegal to compete against the crony. Actually, that's not true. That's a corruption of patents. Patents from the beginning were intended to be a form of liberalization of it, to allow people who otherwise wouldn't be able to protect their property to secure their property. You can listen to Dale Holling and me talk about that in my interview with Dale Holling. But anyway, so Renaissance became more individualistic. Oh yeah, the philosopher, historian Jacob Burckhardt talks about that. He talks about how the Renaissance individualism married more and more. People thought it was good to be an individual, to exercise their individuality, to be different from other people, to have their own opinions, to do what they wanted, to engage in commerce and keep fruits of their labor. They weren't laissez-faire, of course. There were still many restrictions. The guild system in many areas was still in place. But the point is that individualism was growing. Jacob Burckhardt, I think, it's funny, when I first read Jacob Burckhardt talks about growing individualism in the Renaissance, I thought he approved of that. I thought he thought it was morally good. Later on, I read that Jacob Burckhardt is actually politically collectivist. He's on the politically collectivist side. He didn't like individualism. So it's pretty funny that I thought when he wrote about individualism, he was using an approving tone. Oh yeah, I guess I should make something clear. So I think ever since the Renaissance, the general trend has been progress, and since the Renaissance, we've had a net gain in individualism. And you might think that that's weird because, you could say, well, how can you say the line is linear where we keep going up and up and up and we only have progress and get more and more individualistic, both in terms of psychology and philosophy and in our political economic system. Like you say, there's only progress. We've had lots of setbacks along the way. Like communism and Nazism are huge throwbacks to collectivism. They almost destroyed the world. They became huge empires and almost destroyed the West. They almost destroyed the more capitalist, more liberal republics. So how can you say there's only progress? So I have this crude, very unscientific chart. Hopefully that will explain it. So the horizontal axis is time. We're going from, on the left is past, and farther to the right we go is more toward the present or future. And the vertical axis is the standard of living, how good life is for the average person in society, particularly the West. So I think basically we start off very bad. We have very low standard of living as cavemen, and then we have progress. But the progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes we take a detour, we go down, then we go up again, down like a roller coaster. And then I drew us going very down here, a very steep descent, because this is my way of showing you that I can see that yes, sometimes I don't think progress is inevitable. I think sometimes we can screw up and do much worse be much worse off than we were before. Like I would say that the Dark Ages were a time like this, where we had lots of progress early on, and then things got really bad again, and then it took a long time to pull out of that. And we also could have had a very bad time if, like, say, communism won. Communism or Nazism won. If the Nazis and communists, or the communists defeated the United States in war, we'd have another dark age again. So I'm acknowledging that sometimes we can really backtrack and lose what was lost. I mean, we can lose a lot of good stuff we had before. But I think the overall trend since the Renaissance time, even accounting for major setbacks, is we're gaining in standard of living, we're gaining in sophistication, we're getting more civilized. As Steven Pinker from Harvard points out, the rate of violence is going down. So, so this is my unscientific chart showing you how I think we've been progressing. It's like 3 steps up. If going up is good and down is bad, it's like 3 steps up, then 2 steps down, 3 steps up, 2 steps down. So basically, since the Renaissance, we've had progress. Then the Age of Enlightenment came, and that's really when philosophers began to articulate very explicitly how individualism is good. Like, I agree with Ayn Rand, they didn't go far enough. If they want to be consistent individualists, they would have to argue for ethical egoism, and not in the way Adam Smith did. Adam Smith doesn't go far enough. But basically, Enlightenment philosophers, more individualistic, they argue for the free market. You've seen my interview with Kate the Nelligan from the Kate and Bacon Man. You know that I have a lot of complaints about David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, and his attack on inductive reasoning. He didn't actually use the word induction in that context. The point is that he doesn't think you can understand reality from observation. I mean, people think he's an empiricist, and I think he does believe you cannot understand reality from observation, but he thinks you cannot draw a great abstraction, a great general principle from observing many particulars. But I think he really set us back in that regard. But even he was a real free marketer. In politics, he was an individualist. He was for individualist politics. He was a mentor to Adam Smith in that regard. And I think among the best philosophers of the Enlightenment were Jean-Baptiste Say, and again, forgive me if this is a mispronunciation, Antoine Louis-Claude de Tracy. Those were Thomas Jefferson's 2 favorite philosophers. He said they explained economics much better than Adam Smith did, and I agree. So if you want to know who's really awesome, Adam Smith is good, but if you want, but take Thomas Jefferson's advice. Antoine Louis-Claude de Tracy is better, and Say is better too. Tracy is my favorite of the Enlightenment philosophers. Well, actually, I like John Locke too, but John Locke's the one who really started this trend, where where John Locke points out this relationship between reason, independent reason, pardon that redundancy, and political freedom. Freedom, when I say freedom, I mean freedom in the way they say fair capitalist means freedom, where you have a night watchman state. Government protects you from force. It protects you against force and fraud. People can't steal from you. The government's going to protect you from thieves, protects you from murderers, protects you from rapists, protects you from people trying to poison you with their pocket, stops. It's going to prosecute people who poison you. It protects you from fraud, contract breach, all those things. It protects your person and property from force. But it doesn't try to reach. It minimizes the redistribution of wealth. I mean, even the supposedly more like laissez-faire, more capitalist societies have some form of redistribution, unfortunately, like even Hong Kong, even Switzerland. But the point is that the more liberal, more Republican countries, it's not, they don't do this as great a degree, beyond contrast. We have countries like Cuba and North Korea that are very extreme about that. And we have a lot of kleptocracies that are bad too. That are like sort of, they're closer to the way Cuba does things, like Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe, or Venezuela under the Marxist regime. But anyway, John Locke was very much for inductive reasoning, he was for independent reasoning, primary redundancy, and he also supported political freedom. And this is sort of a positive feedback mechanism because it was through exercising inductive reasoning where people like John Locke and Richard Overton realized, hey, we need more political freedom. We need to leave people free to do what they want with their own lives, to think for themselves, and then to act and to implement those free thoughts through the freedom of peaceful action. And in turn, and this is a positive feedback mechanism because when you leave people free to do what they want, think what they want, free speech, and to do what they want, that's freedom of enterprise. Enterprise means doing. So freedom of enterprise means freedom of people to do what they please peaceably. When you leave people to do those things, free thought, free thinking, and free markets in a political freedom, in turn, people exercise more rationality. Now, a lot of my skeptic friends, by skeptic I mean like Michael Sherman types who try to debunk the paranormal, paranormal debunker types, skeptic types. Unfortunately, a lot of them are very statist. They say no, free enterprise is bad because in free enterprise people are free to do stupid things that are very self-harming. Like if you don't police type of drugs people can take, you don't police the type of food people can eat. Well, people are going to eat fatty food. People are going to eat lots of sugar and get fat. And we'll have an obesity epidemic. And if you don't have an FDA to veto the kind of decisions people can make with their bodies, if you don't have an FDA to stop people from taking quack medicines, they'll take quack medicines and then they'll die. So therefore, we need an all-wise government to overrule people for making peaceable but stupid decisions. We need a government to use force to stop people from making self-harming decisions that are peaceful. Like ideas that, like if I take a quack medicine, that's very dumb, but at least I'm not violating your rights. I'm not stealing from you. I'm not damaging your property. I'm just damaging my life. But I know lots of paranormal debunker skeptic types who are like that. They want to ban people from making stupid choices, what they think are stupid choices, and they call that rationality. But no, it's not. It's not being consistently rational. The reason is that if you want people to learn rationality, you have to let them learn through experience. Which means people don't actually, if you want people to learn whether it's rational for them to take certain medicine or not, you're going to have to let them do it and observe the results. And you have to let them observe the results of people around them taking medicines. That's how we learn. So we learn what's wise or foolish only in an environment where people are free to make foolish decisions and we can observe the consequences thereof. Like, if you have some dictator say, well, taking this type of medicine is bad, it's irrational, so I'm going to spare you the pain, but just by outlawing it. What if we had a dictator like that? You think that's rational? What I say is, even if the dictator is correct about that medicine being dangerous, he's not furthering reason. He's not encouraging rational independent thought, because how do you know that? If the dictator just tells you what to think, says, well, you're going to take this medicine and not this medicine, how do you know that he has evidence behind him? How do you know that he isn't just being arbitrary and making stuff up? You would only know that through observation, or listening to people who have made those observations and whom you trust because you've seen they've had good track records. You don't let you're not if some dictator supposedly was wise and could veto all of your foolish choices, it wouldn't let you grow. It wouldn't let you learn from experience, and therefore it wouldn't let you learn from experience to be wise. You wouldn't be wise. You'd just be a pawn, and you would not be exercising reason. It's just doing what the government says, not letting you learn for yourself. That's not exercising reason. So what I tell these paranormal debunker people is, no, it is only people can only learn to be wise and rational if you give them the freedom, if they are allowed the freedom to be um, foolish and irrational, but peaceful. They have to be peaceful. Like if you go around killing people, it's irrational and violent, and you're using force to deprive other people of their ability to live and be rational. So I have to draw the line and say, no, we're not going to allow that. But if you're being peaceful and irrational, making choices that hurt you, are not initiating use of force on other people, I say that should be allowed. And I think when you take the night watchman state position to its logical conclusion, that's what you get. That's necessary if you want to be consistent in letting people exercise rationality and learn through observation. So anyway, John Locke doesn't go as far as I did. He made some concessions to the statists. Like he didn't. I think he even wants atheism to be illegal. But John Locke still advanced freedom of thought, because before John Locke came along, all the different Christian denominations were fighting to outlaw each other, and John Locke said, no, all Christian denominations, the state shouldn't favor one Christian denomination over another. They should all have exercise tolerance over each other. He wouldn't extend the tolerance to atheism, but just him saying different Christian denominations should be equal and one should not be favored over the other, that was a big step. And Thomas Jefferson did say explicitly, yeah, John Locke didn't go far enough. Even atheism should be legal. So first, John Locke exercised individualism, and so doing so exercised reason, and that's when he and Richard Overton and others like them helped create a more politically liberal environment. And in turn, when you have a more politically liberal environment, people can exercise more rationality still, and not just write philosophic treatises, but also engage in material production, meaning they invent new machines, new useful machines like James Watt and steam engine. And in turn, you can use your rationality and your individualism to engage in commerce. You invent something, and then you make multiple units of it, and then you sell it. And that's free enterprise, and that's individualism. And that's what James Watt did. And that led to the Industrial Revolution, led to America's industrial era, it led to people like Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, and what socialists disparage as the Gilded Age. They say it was gold only on the inside, but actually when you look at statistics, when you look at the standard of living increasing, not just for the richest, but even look at how real wages increased for the average worker, find it really was the golden age. Not as good as their material living standards weren't as good as what we have. They weren't as socially tolerant or liberal as we are. But so in that regard, they're not as golden as we are. We're more golden than them in that respect. The point is that they had a lot of progress. The rate at which they progressed is very impressive, and that's what's golden about them. Now, I want to show how, let's say that even though none of these historical people are perfect objectivists, even people who call themselves perfect objectivists, like in 2015, even people who call themselves perfectly objectivists, often when they talk to them, you see their normal behavior. They aren't perfect objectivists. My argument is that even though you don't find perfect objectivists during the Industrial Revolution, you do find that a lot of people in the Industrial Revolution in the West, they came closer implicitly in their actions, in practice, they came closer to being objectivists than, say, hunter-gatherers were, more so than either Sefu, from Eric Michael Johnson's example, either more than Sefu, or the people who in the Migui Pygmy clan who hated him and wanted to banish him. But take, for instance, George Westinghouse. Okay, because a lot of people, including Eric Michael Johnson, have this notion. Even many evolutionary psychologists have this notion that that being a capitalist means you violate other people's rights. If you're a successful business person, they think it means you stole your money from other people, you stole the wealth from other people. They think that's the implication of what Eric Michael Johnson says. And even if you're not stealing outright from people, they have this assumption that you have to be ruthless and mean and psychologically abusive to be successful. That's an accusation they often level against Steve Jobs. They say, well, he didn't steal from people, but he was still psychologically abusive, and you have to be psychologically abusive for other people to succeed. So I want to bring up the case study of George Westinghouse. George Westinghouse was compared to Thomas Edison. He is responsible for he's responsible for electrifying America. In many respects, even more responsible for that than Thomas Edison. Because Thomas Edison only wanted to supply energy with direct current, and you need a lot of generators. And if you only use direct current can only be sent over short distances. And it was George Westinghouse who learned about inventors like Lucien Gallard, and John Gibbs, and Nikola Tesla, and William Stanley, and he put all of their inventions together into a single system. He was an inventor himself. He invented the railroad air brake, and he recognized other good inventions when he saw them, and he integrated them into a single electrical system. And he said, let's use Nikola Tesla's polyphase induction motor. If we use alternating current to send electricity over long distances, so we can have one power station, and send it out to households spread out all over the country, and that's much more efficient than Thomas Edison's system. It's misleading though when people say that it's Thomas Edison's direct current against George Westinghouse's alternating current. It's misleading because George Westinghouse's system used both AC and DC. The idea is that he has one power station centrally located, and through alternating current, uses alternating current to send out the electricity over long distances, and eventually at the end of the line, AC line, it goes to another power generator that transforms it from AC to DC, and that smaller generator then goes out to households. Uses DC to send the electricity to households, and because it's converted from AC to DC, it's safer that way. Because AC is likelier to electrocute you. So Westinghouse's system converted AC, used AC to send out the electricity over long distances, and then when it reached the neighborhood, the electricity is converted to DC, which is safer for you when it goes into your household. But anyway, Nikola Tesla said to the very end of his life, Nikola Tesla said, the George Westinghouse is a very square guy. You know, he had confidence in my invention when other people didn't. Thomas Edison was rude to me and, not helping me at all. George Westinghouse was there for me, helping me out. Some people try to say George Westinghouse cheated Nikola Tesla because, um, at one point he was running out of money. He and Nikola Tesla struck a deal. George Westinghouse made a down payment of several $1,000s to Nikola Tesla, and their contract also said that Nikola Tesla would be paid royalties per unit of electricity produced. A specific fixed month, fixed specific sum would go to Nikola Tesla. George Westinghouse said that later told him he was having money problems. He wanted to renegotiate the contract. Nikola Tesla said to him, you've been square with me. You had confidence in me when other people didn't. So you don't have to pay me royalties at all. And Nikola Tesla ripped up the contract. And some fans of Nikola Tesla like to say, oh, George Westinghouse conned Nikola Tesla. He manipulated him. But no. What George Westinghouse told Nikola Tesla was true. He did have those problems. Nikola Tesla took the initiative to say, well, don't pay me the royalties. Nikola Tesla didn't have to do that. He could have said, okay, we're going to renegotiate the contract, and now the royalties are going to be smaller, but you still have to pay me the royalties. So saying that George Westinghouse cheated Nikola Tesla is untrue. Even when Nikola Tesla was old, after George Westinghouse died, and Nikola Tesla was very old, near the end of his life, he still had very fond memories of George Westinghouse, and he still had a very favorable view of him. And that's a lot of historians will talk about how George Westinghouse's employees felt the same way. They even accused him of exploiting him. We all can hear these horror stories supposedly about greedy industrialist robber barons in the 19th century exploiting their workers, and their workers hate them and go and strike against them. That didn't happen with George Westinghouse. He was very square with them. The only example I can think of where he seemed sort of ruthless was that the high tension wires that transmitted AC electricity, they really were dangerous. Thomas Edison tried to have them banned. Harold Pitney Brown, who sort of indirectly worked with Thomas Edison, was sort of a propagandist, trying to get lobbying for AC to be banned. And I'm glad their efforts didn't succeed. But it is true that AC was very dangerous, and workers were electrocuted by it. And one criticism of Westinghouse that might be legitimate is that when people were electrocuted by the AC, by high tension wires transmitting AC power, he was slow to respond to it. He should have responded more quickly. He should have been more responsive and more sensitive to that. He was very slow in that regard. But, he's not some villain out there trying to cheat people. I don't even think he was the type of cut corners. He was very ethical, and I think that he became a multimillionaire not in spite of him being that ethical, but as a consequence of him being that ethical, because people knew, the more he dealt with people, the more they knew they could trust him, and the trust allowed him to garner more and more contracts, more and more deals, more and more contacts. He built up a well-deserved reputation for honesty. Honesty, not because people were duped, but because people saw with their own eyes and were rational in observing his track record. And so I think that's sort of a model for how you want a rational, peaceable egoist, where you look out for your own self-interest without violating other people's rights. And probably if George Westinghouse died before Ayn Rand's books came out, but let's say hypothetically, if you have a time machine, you went to George Westinghouse and you showed him Ayn Rand's books and asked him, do you agree with that philosophy? He would probably say no. No, I do believe in the public good and all that. Because that's the lip service practically all business people give. It's very unusual to come up meet a business person who says, yeah, I agree with ethical egoism. Like the great inventor and entrepreneur T.J. Rogers does that. He does say, yeah, I agree with the virtue of selfishness. Well, most of them don't. So a lot of people say, see, so that proves that Ayn Rand's wrong. But I want you to look at the behavior of someone like George Westinghouse. What does he do in practice? In practice, I think he strongly adhered to what we can say is more of the ethical egoist ethos, where he didn't violate people's rights, he didn't steal from them, he didn't con them. He was very peaceful, and at the same time, he was looking out for his own material self-interest. He did want to get very, very rich, and he succeeded. And more important, he wanted to have a job that he liked, that he felt good about, and and he succeeded there. And none of that precludes charity, because when Ayn Rand says you should support your self-interest, she doesn't just mean acquire as much money as possible and never mind other considerations affecting your happiness. No, she wants you to have a balanced, long-range peace of mind form of happiness. So you meet people who you value, who share values with you, whom you genuinely appreciate, and when you help them out, that's consistent with Ayn Rand's ethical egoism. So is that serving your happiness? Is serving your long-term self-interest? What Aristotle would call your eudaimonia. Same thing with helping out your family. Not because you have a duty to help your family, even if they treat you rotten. That's not what she means. But you have family members with whom you have mutual respect. They love you genuinely, and you love them genuinely, and you do things for each other not because you're pressured to, but because you have this true love. And when you help them out, that is also consistent with Ayn Rand's ethical egoism. I have to say this because of all the straw men that critics like to throw around whack at regarding Ayn Rand's ethical egoism. So, in that respect, when you look at successful entrepreneurs who are like George Westinghouse, you find that in practice, implicitly, they do, it seems that they do follow Ayn Rand's ethics, at least much more so than people in the past. And what are the consequences of this? I think that in many respects, this new individualist ethos practiced by someone like Westinghouse, that is a folkway, and it is a reproductive strategy, not the same as hunter-gatherers, but it is a reproductive strategy, a more individualistic reproductive strategy. And what's the result? Well, another thing is that when people like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Frederick Douglass remade the political system, they created, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson used John Locke's philosophy as like a model. They created a new political system, a more liberal Republican political system. Likewise, of course, they didn't go far enough. They still allowed slavery in the Constitution, which is a contradiction. But then you have people like Frederick Douglass come along, who resolved those contradictions. Where Frederick Douglass worked to abolish slavery and make the United States more consistently liberal Republican. So these people, and when they did that, that was another folkway. That's another way of reshaping the environment to suit your purposes, purposes of people in your society whom you value. That's also an evolutionary adaptation. So the changes in the political system to a more liberal Republican system is also a folkway. The whole liberal Republican capitalist system is a folk way too, an adaptation. So you have one model. You have the hunter-gatherer model, which is collectivist, not 100% collectivist, but more collectivist. Tends to be more collectivist side. You have like communist model, Nazi model, totalitarian model, which is also more collectivist. And then you have the liberal Republican capitalist model. All these are different folk ways, all reproductive strategies. They're all things that you can choose from. When I say that, I don't mean, well, you can live under freedom even if all your neighbors want to be communists. If they're the majority, they'll impose communism on you. The majority wants a welfare state, they'll impose it on you. What I mean is that as long as you have freedom of speech, you can argue persuasively, like John Locke did. You can get people to see the reason, observe the results. You can change people's minds, and together you can pass a tipping point where if you convince enough people, you can make the society more liberal Republican. And that's what people like John Locke and Richard Overton did. It's people like Thomas Jefferson did, and John Adams did. Now can the free market advocates of today do something similar? That has yet to be seen. So we have quite a fight ahead of us. But I think that free market view has become considered more accepted considered more intellectually respectable in the past few years, and some of that's a reaction to people seeing the horrible results of the welfare state, seeing the bad results of having President Obama's policies implemented, seeing the bad results of the welfare state in modern Greece, things like that. But anyway, I'm not the doom and gloom people. I'm not doom and gloom about the future like many objectivists are. But anyway, going back to people like George Westinghouse. So people like John Locke changed our environment by changing the political environment, which allowed, and that in turn gave more freedom for industrialists to invent new technologies that improved our living standards. And what's the result of this? Many people, including evolutionary psychologists, would say, well, that doesn't prove that the liberal Republican model, or people acting as capitalists and inventors, that doesn't mean that they are more reproductively fit, that they are more evolutionarily and reproductively fit than hunter-gatherer clans are, because people in the modern industrial environment have fewer children. Just today, well, actually, it was yesterday. Yesterday, I saw a chart by the economist Max Rosser. He's an interesting guy because he shows how there's all these charts showing improvements of living standards that came since the Industrial Revolution, since the Industrial Age. He shows all these charts because from showing improvements in our living standards. But then he tries to attribute this mostly to the regulatory entitlement state and not to laissez-faire, not to liberalization, not to deregulation, not to the market, not to the profit board. He tries to attribute the gains in living standards to regulatory entitlement state. But that's why I wrote this book, because I use charts similar to the ones that Max Rosser shows off, and I applaud him for showing those charts. But he's wrong about causation. He's not correct in that respect. I show and I argue and provide evidence showing how improvements of living standards are not the consequence of the regulatory entitlement state, not the consequence of safety regulations, not a consequence of the FDA or OSHA or any of those things, but the progress happened in spite of those things. And I show how workplace safety was improving before there was OSHA, before there were child labor laws, about how people were getting safer, and all these hazards, rate of which these hazards were happening, was already decreasing before we had all these safety agencies, before we had the EPA. Even air pollution was going down before there was a Clean Air Act. And so why I think there's evidence in favor of all that progress happening as a consequence of entrepreneurs acting freely in the free market, to the extent that the market was free, and in spite of the regulatory entitlement state, which often got in their way but didn't fully succeed in obstructing them from accomplishing their goals. So, but anyway, Max Roser shows a pertinent chart that I saw yesterday, and it says back in 1950, over 80% of all the people in the world had more than, it was either 3 children or 5 children. But anyway, the point is that women gave birth a lot more back then. By contrast, in our times, 80% of the people have fewer than 5 children. They give birth to, the number of times. So basically, more people have gotten rich, the more we've liberalized, more our living standards have increased, the fewer times on average in a woman's life does she give birth. So does that mean, since women give birth fewer times, does that mean we're less Darwinian, we're less being less reproductively fit? My answer is no, because that's not all there is to propagating your genes to the next generation. Remember, it's not just giving birth to babies. Part of ensuring your genetic legacy is also making sure that your children grow up and become old enough to have their own kids. And that requires a reduction in the child mortality rate. And fact is that it was the modern liberal Republican industrial environment that reduced the child mortality rate. For twofold. First, because increased freedom allowed for more technological innovation, and then when technological innovation happened, people did all sorts of medical advances. They discovered how you treat diseases. They discovered how to deal with birth complications. They invented new medical devices, and that's what reduced the child mortality rate. And so that's why, even though the number of births per woman has gone down, the number of people surviving into adulthood has increased, and that's why the population has grown. And I'm not going to explain it here, but I think you can read Julian Simon and Peter Diamandis and Bjorn Lomborg and Kurzweil about how increases in population aren't going to destroy us. As long as we're free, the George Westinghouses of today can innovate, and innovate, and it goes like this. Insofar as people are free, every input of natural resources imposes a cost on the entrepreneur. Sometimes business people can cut costs if the government subsidizes them. The government, takes money from taxpayers and then gives it to the business person. Or if the business person can't impose himself, he can cut costs. If he can cut costs, if he is supposed to dispose of waste byproducts from his production process, and if he just imposes, and he just cuts the cost for himself by imposing them on other people, by dumping waste in the river, or through loss of air pollution that poisons your lungs. If they can get away with that, that cuts their own costs. But the solution is to recognize private property. If someone's cutting his own costs by polluting the river that you drink from, you should recognize that the river is your own private property. If the river is recognized as private property owner, and sue the polluter, transfer those costs back to the polluter, and there comes a point where polluting other people's stuff is much costlier to the business person than it is to dispose of these things properly. Same thing goes with air pollution. If if someone is putting toxic fumes in your air that hurts your private property, so you sue that person, transfer the cost back to him, and if he gets hit with enough lawsuits, it comes to a point where it's cheaper for him to refrain from poisoning you. So anyway, when people when a business person can't impose costs on you through force like that, every input of natural resources represents a cost to him. So what does he do? He has to find new ways of extracting a greater amount of value, economic value, more units, or keep the unit the same while making his methods more efficient so that he uses ever fewer and ever smaller inputs of labor and or non-renewable natural resources and or capital. Capital like machinery is also made from natural resources and entrepreneurship. When entrepreneurs use like machines to make stuff, those machines were made by other entrepreneurs who were being efficient in managing the laborers and converting those natural resources into those machines. Anyway, the point is that if you're an entrepreneur and you can't impose your costs on others because you're in the laissez-faire liberal free economy, the way for you to increase your profit is to find ways of producing the same quantity of economic value or a greater quantity of economic value, even as per unit of what you produce, smaller and fewer inputs of human labor, like man hours, and natural resources go into that. And Bjorn Lomborg gives many good examples of that. And examples of that are also in this book. For example, back in 1950, it took 8 pounds of coal to produce a specific quantity of electricity. And in modern times, it takes only 1 pound of coal to produce that same quantity of electrical power. So you see how it takes less coal to produce the same amount of electricity today as it did back in 1950. And that's why the resource depletion, this notion that capitalism depletes resources is false. So you don't have so all this progress has reduced the child mortality rate, which in turn has led to increases in the overall population size. But it doesn't follow that under capitalism and the free markets that will exacerbate resources. Again, it's under collectivism where people are not allowed to earn the fruits of their own labor, where people are not incentivized to become more efficient. And that's where you have resource depletion problems. Those are the resource depletion problems that plagued the Soviet Union. Those are the resource depletion problems that plagued hunter-gatherer plans. And it's a total myth that the Nazis were economically efficient. Ian Kershaw, the historian, busts that out and he shows that Nazis were also inefficient. They're very similar to the Soviets in that regard. So was Mussolini's Italy. The trains did not run on time. So my argument is this: there's still hunter-gatherer clans living today, but they cannot sustain a large population, because their ways are not as productive. There are hundreds of hunter-gatherers like that, but they can't sustain large populations. Our society can't sustain a larger population because all these progress, liberalization, political economic liberalization, and for-profit enterprise has increased our reproductive fitness. And even if we have every mother has fewer kids, gives birth fewer times. The average mother gives birth fewer times than does the average mother in a hunter-gatherer clan. It doesn't follow that our reproductive fitness is smaller because we have more kids. Even if we have fewer kids, those kids are much likelier to live, to reach adulthood, and have kids of their own. So we're not less reproductively fit. We're more reproductively fit in that regard than our hunter-gatherer clans. And I say this is a consequence of individualism, of the political economic liberalization, of the peaceable pursuit of self-interest. All those things are consistent with Ayn Rand's philosophy. Those are good folk ways. Those are all the things Eric Michael Johnson hates, and which he and many other evolutionary psychologists say we should turn our back on. Because so you see the folly here in Eric Michael Johnson citing Colin Turnbull's anecdote about Safu and the hunt for civets, and saying, well, this shows how Ayn Rand is wrong. The Safu didn't have much choice, because in terms of technology, in terms of how their society is structured, in terms of their political economic system, because the U.S. hunter-gatherer clans do have a government where rules are enforced by violence. Hunter-gatherer clans are not anarchists. The notion that they're anarchists is a misunderstanding. But anyway, because of how their political system is structured, how their economic system is structured, because of their technological limitations, it's the case that, yeah, maybe if you are a Mabuti pygmy, yeah, you have to participate. Everyone has to participate as one team, one firm, and no matter how many civets you catch, it doesn't determine how much you get to eat, because someone else has to decide that. Yeah, maybe if that's the case, maybe your only choices are to be like Sefu or the people who were against him. And Sefu didn't have an option of saying, screw you guys, I'm going to go my own way, and even if I'm separate from your society, I'm still going to survive. Sefu didn't have the option. But guess what? Guess what, Eric Michael Johnson? We're not like that. We're not in that social environment. We're in a different political environment. And we're in a political environment that's very different, economic environment that's different exactly because of the individualism you hate. Because some weirdos decided to deviate from the hunter-gatherer clan model and say we're going to do things differently, even if other people don't approve. They weren't as nonconformist and extreme in their nonconformism as Ayn Rand is, but they did deviate more than what your favorite hunter-gatherers would prefer. And those deviations from the norm, from those collectivist norms, got bigger and bigger and bigger until you have someone like George Westinghouse, until you have someone like Ayn Rand, and they can say, well, I don't want to share stuff with you. I'm going to go my own way. And even if you all ostracize and boycott them, it doesn't follow that they're going to starve and die, because they can find other people in their own society who are willing to cooperate with them voluntarily, where they can do what they want. Sefu couldn't say, yeah, I'm going to go my own way, and I leave you alone, you leave me alone, and that's that. Sefu couldn't do that. But because someone wanted to be individualistic and egoistic, more so than what was normal at the time, that society changed to agrarian, and then to more individualistic, and then more political economic liberal, and went to the Renaissance, and then to the Age of Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. Now, a modern Sefu, someone who's like Sefu in our country, in our time, can get away with saying, yeah, I don't want to share the bounty with you. I want it to be where if I am more productive than you, I get paid more. And if you don't like that, if you try to ostracize that person and ban that person, he can go off on his own way, and he's not going to die. He's not going to starve. So your whole citing of Colin Turnbull's anecdote is inapplicable, Eric Michael Johnson. It's completely inapplicable. You're saying the anecdote about Sefu fails utterly to refute Ayn Rand's objectivist ethics. A more individualist ethic created this new political economic environment. And in turn, in this political economic environment, the rational egoist approach becomes more and more viable. And that applies even if people are more emotionally attached to the word altruism, even if they agree with your more collectivist politics, even if they like the wealth regulatory entitlement state. Despite all of that, definitely Ayn Randian ethos is more viable than you have given it credit for. So that's my case for saying Ayn Randian philosophy is a folkway, and even if you don't like it, even if you want to accept it, fine, then don't. But it is on the table, it is up for consideration as a viable folkway for people who follow, as a viable evolutionary adaptation to follow, and you don't have any substantial proof that if everyone switched to the Ayn Randian ethics, which remember allows for charity, doesn't preclude charity, doesn't preclude raising your own children, you have no evidence that if everyone switched to that, it would be the end of civilization. It would cause reproductive fitness to plummet. It would cause infant mortality rates to go back up again. You have no evidence of that. Even when people, in their explicit philosophies, in their rhetoric, even when they say, yeah, I don't agree with Ayn Rand, when you look at their behavior, when you look at someone like George Westinghouse, you see that acting implicitly more in the Ayn Randian mold doesn't obstruct you from being happy, from raising your kids, from living a productive life, from doing things that contribute to the lowering of the infant mortality rate. So that's my argument there. But I want to add one final point. Am I being like Adam Smith? I mean, because Adam Smith did say that it's okay for you to serve your own self-interest peaceably, but even then he had to couch it in this utilitarian collectivist terms. He had to say, yeah, this is justified because if you're an entrepreneur, you only look out for your own self-interest, you do it peacefully. This is justified as only because someone other than you benefits from it. It's only justified because your customers benefit from it, your employees benefit from it. He didn't want to go as far as Ayn Rand and say, it took an Ayn Rand to say, so that's not the final justification. The justification is you're being peaceful, you're not obstructing other people from their own self-interest, you're serving your own self-interest, and that's good enough. And what if you were being a violent person and violating other people's rights? Would that really be in your long-term self-interest? Ayn Rand and I say no, it's not practicable. That increases the likelihood of retaliation. If you violate other people's rights, it increases the likelihood of retaliation. If you're a con man trying to fool people on the other time, it's much worse than being consistently honest. If you're consistently honest with other people, they might sort of dislike you telling the truth a lot. But the fact is that if you give them evidence for what you're saying, reality isn't working against you. Reality is on your side, and time is on your side. And the likelihood is, as time goes on, people are likely to acknowledge you're correct. But if you're a con man, always trying to lie to people, the fact is that you can't outsmart reality. So if you're a con man, always trying to lie to people and trying to cover it up, you can't cover up everything. You always leave behind evidence of what really went on. That's a natural law. It's a principle of nature. And even people who are really good at trying to cover up evidence of the crimes, they miss something. And time is not on their side because as time goes on, there's likelier evidence of them being exposed. So that's not practicable. Even if people weren't retaliating, if people, if you were violating other people's rights, that encourages other people to be ruthless as well and violate their rights as well. And if there comes a point where everyone wants to loot everyone else and no one wants to produce stuff on their own, well, there will be less of an incentive for other people to produce wealth for you to steal. There'll be less production, and then there'll be less and less wealth to steal. And even the looters will have nothing left to take. So that's not a viable option. A viable option, if you want to serve your long-term self-interest, the most practical way is to be peaceful, respect people's rights, not violate them, not hurt them, not even be a jerk to them, not even be psychologically abusive for them. But be a square, peaceful person like George Westinghouse, and being principled like that, pursuing your own goals, your own happiness, and your own self-interest. But that's not. But anyway, this is not why saying that this is a viable option that doesn't cut into your reproductive fitness. That's not my final. That's not my final argument. Okay, so oh yeah, by the way, this book is called Moral Tribes by Joshua Green. He gives the conventional evolutionary psychologist argument that I laid out in part 1. So if you want to learn, here's one book among many that you can read to learn what their view is. It's not the straw man, it's not genetic determinism or any of that. This guy's famous for the trolley problem. He takes an fMRI of your brain, he takes a scan of your brain, and he asks you, well, would you directly kill someone if it could save the lives of 5 other people? And then he takes a scan of your brain and he sees what parts of your brain light up when you answer the question. And he says, well, depending upon how the question is framed, whether you're thinking in very abstract terms or whether you're asked to do the dirty work yourself, determines which parts of your brain lights up, whether it's the more visceral, empathetic side, or whether it's the more abstract, impersonal side. So I have many arguments. There are many flaws in his approach there too, and I also cover that in this book. I won't be doing it in this video. But here's another problem with the evolutionary psychologist argument. Many objectivists would say this is I just should have made this argument and not given this long spiel about that I just gave about how gene culture coevolution to its logical conclusion. You have to recognize that the individualist, egoist approach, implicitly Randian approach, is also a folk way that has helped people adapt to the environment and reduced infant mortality, and has helped the reproductive fitness of our society. Many objectives say I shouldn't have even bothered with all of that. I should have just gotten to this part. But no, I think the spiel I gave is necessary. I think if people are going to follow all that, people who are sympathetic to evolutionary psychology, follow everything I've said. I think it will make them easier for them to accept objectivist ethics and see how just because kin selection being valid is not sufficient to refute the objectivist ethics. And I think if evolutionary psychology fans follow all of what I said, and you don't have to agree with everything I said. I could have gotten some details mistaken, but the general thrust, they judge the general thrust of it correct. And it can show them how Michael Johnson's silly argument against objectivism just doesn't fly. Same thing with Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer is much more sympathetic to liberalization and capitalism than is Michael Johnson. Like he claims to be a former objectivist, but if he was, he didn't understand it too clearly, because Michael Shermer makes a lot of strawman arguments against objectivism too. Not exactly the same ones as Eric Michael Johnson, because Michael Shermer is more sympathetic to capitalism. But I also cover Michael Shermer. I explain what Michael Sherman's strawman. When Michael Shermer makes the supposed argument against objectivism, I explain what the strawmen are in the book. So here's the final argument. I am not saying that final justification for objectivist ethics is that it is a legitimate folk way that will not. It's a legitimate folk way, and that it can still contribute to furthering species. And if you're an objectivist, you can still use that to propagate your genetic legacy to future generations. I'm not saying that as the final justification for objectivism. I give a long explanation to show you how being an objectivist is not in conflict with kin selection. It's not in conflict with gene culture coevolution. And these things are not mutually exclusive. Your being an objectivist doesn't inhibit you from propagating your genetic legacy across generations. It doesn't inhibit you from participating in the kin selection process. That is what I'm getting at. That's why evolutionary you can't. It's wrong to say objectivism is a dead end evolutionarily. It's not. That's why evolutionary psychology and kin selection do not refute the objectivist ethics. Now I'm going to give a very simple explanation about why all the things I said is not found justification for the objectivist ethics. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the supposed is-ought gap. Because David Hume said, well, you can look at all these facts, and from the facts you cannot extrapolate what's morally correct, what you ought to do. And of course, Ayn Rand disagrees with that. Objectivism disagrees with that. I disagree with it. But in some ways, evolutionary psychologists are similar to objectivists in that they also reject the supposed is-ought bridge. Richard Dawkins contradicts himself here because in his on his writings, sometimes he says he agrees with David Hume's is-ought gap. He says, yeah. He says, well, we got facts. You can't look at facts and then get your ought, your prescriptive rules, your moral rules from the facts. Therefore, when I say, evolution is one way, I'm not saying things ought to be wise. So therefore, when I say something's normal in natural selection, I'm not saying you ought to do that. And he contradicts himself because, he says, because in other times he says, yeah, morality is a custom that comes from gene culture coevolution. That's correct, and gene culture coevolution is a fact. And he's saying the implication what he's saying is that if you look at the facts, you ought to adopt his view of what's morally correct. But if you do that, then you're implicitly conceding. Then that's implicitly conceding that yes, ought does come from is. So I think Sam Harris might be more consistent in that. I think he might be more upfront about rejecting the is-ought gap. But I would have to double check that. But basically, evolutionary psychologists do try to get ought from is, but I think they get the mistaken ought. It goes like this. They say, well, Richard Dawkins' theory of the selfish gene is correct. That is how the gene operates. That's how genes operate. Therefore, because of this, from this is we form this ought. The ought is you ought to do things that perpetuate your germline. It doesn't necessarily mean you're obligated to have kids. It doesn't mean if you don't have kids of your own, you're a failure. But they do think you ought to do other things that help your society. Like, if you help your siblings out, that makes it likelier for them to have kids, and then you do things to help them out, help them raise your kids, and all your contributions help increase the likelihood that your siblings' kids will have kids of their own and all of that. Well, that contributes to you're still furthering your own genes through kin selection. So they'd say, well, that's good enough. Or even helping people who are not related to you but who are in your society. They would say, well, remember the hunter-gatherer plans did not make a distinction between family and society. Therefore, if you're helping society, then by hunter-gatherer standards, you're helping out your family. So that's good too. Therefore, evolutionary psychologists think just because of those facts, just because of the selfish gene exists and does these things, that proves you are obligated to perpetuate gene culture coevolution and kin selection. And so basically, we see that's basically saying that reproduction, procreation, is standard of value, and individuals' well-being is not the standard of value. Procreation is, just like how ideas that it's better to be a self-sacrificing praying mantis or a self-sacrificing male spider than it is for the spider to look out for its own self-interest. There's a saying, and it goes like this. I think it's attributed to Samuel Butler. It encapsulates the evolutionary psychologist's point of view, even though the saying is from the 19th century. It goes, a chicken is just an egg's way of getting another egg. What they mean by this is that the reproduction is this procreation is a standard of value. Like, say we have an egg J, and it hatches into a chick. It goes into a chick J, and then this chicken J lays an egg called egg K. The idea is that the organism, the chicken, is just a means to an end, means to a more important end, which is procreation. You see, the organism itself is just a means to the end, which is procreation. The selfish gene is more important than the organism itself. That's the implication there. So I'm going to give a rebuttal to that. No, even if the selfish gene theory is correct, even if kin selection is correct, the organism still has to be the life of the organism, life not just the physical survival, not just the absence of death, but like the happiness and well-being. That has to be standard of value. The idea is that if you're living well and prospering, you're not just surviving in a way that's adaptive. You're surviving in a way that, if you're living well and happy, it will probably be easier for you to raise your children. So living well and happily probably isn't a sign you're living correctly and well adaptively. But the survival of the organism is still standard of value, and I'll tell you why. This is I'm adapting my argument from one given by Harry Binswanger in this book, The Biological Basis of Teleological Concepts. And it goes like this. The organism, especially if you're a sapient organism like a human, has to make decisions, it has to make evaluations, it has to judge priorities, it has to it values things. The organism is capable of valuing stuff. It can value its own life, it can value its children, it can value procreation. Can procreation value anything? No, because procreation is not an entity. Okay, organisms are entities. They are things that exist in physical reality. They have substance. Procreation is not an entity. It is an action of the entities. Procreation is the action of organisms. It's the action organisms take. So procreation cannot value organisms. An organism can value procreation. Procreation cannot value organisms. Therefore, it's still the organism that must make evaluations. It's the organism that has to make moral choices. It's the organism that makes evaluations according to whether values, actions, or entities according to how they benefit the organism. So the conclusion I draw is not, well, I'm capable of reproduction. Selfish gene exists, and I'm capable of reproduction. Therefore, it's my duty to reproduce. So I'm only good if I succeed in propagating genetic legacies. No, it's procreation and the selfish gene are good because they produce me. They're good. I'm the standard of value. I just think according to how they affect me. Procreation is good. Selfish gene is good. All those things are good only because they created me. And and if I have kids, they can think the same thing. Procreation is good because it led to them. So the organism has priority. And Harry Binswanger gives this example, like, say there's a mother bird, and she lays eggs and they hatch, and they have little baby birds. Then a predator comes by, and the predator is going to eat the babies. So the mother creates a diversion. The mother gets the predator's attention, diverts the predator's attention away from the babies. This endangers the mother's life, and the mother might die as a result. Now, is this an example of altruism? Does this prove that altruism is like a moral thing for an organism to do? Does it mean that the mother's life is less important than the selfish gene? Harry Binswanger says no. He says what's really going on is this. The organism's life is still the priority. It's just that this is sort of a payment. The mother bird that's doing this probably came to existence because its mother did something similar. If the mother was one day vulnerable to a predator in a similar way, probably it survived as a consequence of its mother doing something similar. And because it inherited its mother's genes, she's doing something similar to what the mother did. So this is like a delayed payment. This is payment. This sort of behavior helped the mother bird survive in the past, and her doing this now is delayed payment for that. Had she not inherited these genes, she would not be alive here today. I mean, if it was not for those genes that cause this behavior, the mother bird would not be alive today, and this is a delayed payment for that. So, and the bird's willing to pay that price for her having been able to reach that, for being alive since when she was a little baby and vulnerable. This is payment for that. So her life is still the priority. Her life is source of the values, not the procreation. And that's when you're talking about non-sapient organisms, that's the only alternative they have. For humans, it's different. We are sapient, we can philosophize over these things, we can ruminate on these things. And we have more than one option. If this, like what I said earlier, maybe Samuel Bowles is correct that in order for me to have gotten here, it's the case that my ancestors had to be sort of warlike and be willing. Some of my ancestors had to be willing to risk dying in warfare and be self-sacrificial in that regard. But things are different now because some individualists work to make the situation different. We're in a different political, economic environment, we're a different physiological environment. We're not as vulnerable to elements anymore because we have, buildings, we have air conditioning, things that make the climate safer for us. We have irrigation, which makes us less vulnerable to dehydration and thirst. So we have multiple options available to now. So just because my ancestors might have been self-sacrificing, it doesn't follow that I have to be self-sacrificing as a delayed payment for them being self-sacrificing. So the individual, it still matters. The objectivist meta-ethics remains unrefuted. And the objectivist ethics remains unrefuted. So I think when evolutionary psychologists say that all the stuff they cite proves objectivism wrong, they fail. But I want to be clear. I made this set of videos because I want to be clear. Evolutionary psychology often deserves respect. It doesn't deserve dismissal that it receives from objectivists and non-objectivists alike. Evolutionary psychologists often do have good points. They do often cite interesting facts for which we should account. So I agree with many of the facts cited. I think there is kin selection. I think Samuel Bowles might be correct in his calculation. I agree with their gene culture coevolution. And even if we take all these things into account, and I think they deserve to be taken into account. Evolutionary psychologists are incorrect to assume that taking those things into account prove that the objectivist ethics is unworkable. That's not the case. And I give a more detailed explanation and argument in this book. I had it plugged enough, really. And if you want to know details on the sources that I cite, if you want to know where I learned about that experiment with the green and orange shirts, it's in this book. I can't say all these things off the top of my head, so that you should go get the book. And I make many other great arguments. I give a more complete defense of capitalism. I give a more complete rebuttal to the Malthusian resource depletion argument against capitalism. All those things. So I want to thank you very much for your time. I did this for my self-interest, not for you, but second to my own interest. I hope you found this fun and worthwhile. Thank you very much.